Lulu White was one of the most notorious madams of the 1890s and early 1900s. According to every source I have seen, she was born in Selma, Alabama in 1868, but she liked to lie about her origins. She would claim to be from Jamaica sometimes. Other times, she would claim to be from Cuba. It seems that her goal was to create an aura of exoticism about herself. And the reason? To attract wealthy white men to herself and her girls, who were her prostitutes. If they seemed like they were more than just prostitutes from New Orleans, but instead well-born, well-educated, and charming young women from exotic places, a higher price could be charged for their services. Lulu White had several run-ins with the law in her time for a multitude of things, including attempted murder and selling alcohol. But let's be very clear, she made her fortune selling sex, and she came up with some very innovative ways to do her job. Let's get into it. Lulu White was born Lulu Henley in 1868 in Selma, Alabama. Many of the details about her early years are vague, and it seems that that's the way she wanted it. When she knew that sex work was going to be her chosen path, she began a process of reinventing herself. So, rather than admit that she was from plain old Selma, Alabama, she began to tell people that she was from Jamaica or Cuba. At some point in the early 1880s, Lulu moved to New Orleans and started working as a prostitute. So, if her birth year of 1868 is correct, she could have been prostituting as early as 12 or 13 years old. She first appears in the New Orleans City Directory in 1888, in a neighborhood comprised of colored female boarding houses and brothels. She made a series of pornographic photos either in the 1880s or early 1890s, perhaps for financial gain or increased publicity or both. And by the early 1890s, she was already a madam, running her own whorehouse. They say that timing is everything, and this was the case for Lulu White's success in the sex work industry. Throughout the existence of New Orleans, prostitution had been tolerated and even accepted. But at the end of the 1800s, there was a social purity movement happening in the United States that even the city of New Orleans could not escape, despite its history of being a place where one could enjoy many vices. Parts of this social purity movement included restricting and even outlawing prostitution. The man pushing the purity movement in New Orleans was Sidney Story. He was an alderman who, in 1897, introduced an ordinance to limit prostitution to a 10-square block district in the city's 4th Ward. He was successful in getting his ordinance to pass, bringing a semblance of conservative traditional values to his sinful city. He had to have been proud of himself. He was probably also shocked when the local New Orleans newspapers named the new red light district after him. He was Sidney Story. They called the vice district Storyville, forever attaching his name to the prostitutes he wanted to shut down. Typically, thoughts of prostitution are accompanied by thoughts of low rent, crime, and bad neighborhoods. But the property values increased after Storyville was named a red light district because of the clientele who was to be entertained there, elite and wealthy white men. They proved to be very big spenders, and they were coming from all over the country. Before this area became the red light district known as Storyville, it was a mostly black neighborhood full of working class people. After it became Storyville, things changed. Let's just say that gentrification is nothing new. Rents in Storyville increased as much as 1,500%, so it goes without saying that many of its previous residents had to move out. In addition to participating in the nation's purity movement at the turn of the century, New Orleans was also advertising its warm temperatures and fun activities in an attempt to get a piece of the pie of the winter tourism market, one of the potential excursions that was promoted was the city's prostitution district. Brothels in Storyville could legally only serve white men. The brothels could employ white prostitutes or black ones. However, they were required to be segregated, meaning that one house could employ either white or black prostitutes, but not both. I suppose that what Lulu White was doing was considered something in the middle. Not black prostitutes, not white prostitutes, but she only employed octoroons. I think that by today's standards, most of us would call Lulu's prostitutes white, but in the 1880s, they were distinctly classified as octoroons, and though they almost always looked white, they were not allowed to identify as such. Octoroon is a dated and offensive term which describes someone who is 1/8 black by descent, having one black great-grandparent. Again, they look white because they basically are, and these were the girls and women who Lulu employed to work in her beautiful mansion on Basin Street in Storyville. Storyville was a high-rent district, and Lulu had the money that she needed to be a major player in it. She paid $40,000 to have her brothel constructed. That $40,000 has the same buying power of about $1.4 million today in 2022. And when all was said and done, she had a 4-story mansion with a swirling staircase, marble floors, 15 bedrooms, each with their own private baths, 5 parlors, an elevator, ornate chandeliers, luxurious furniture, and walls lined with mirrors. She named her whorehouse Mahogany Hall, a nod to the partially black women who worked there at 235 North Basin Street. Remember, Lulu had been all about selling an image since she had started lying about where she was born. Her whorehouse needed to sell an image as well. It needed to scream that she had money so that she could get even more of it from the rich men who were coming to visit her girls. But it didn't stop there. Of course, Lulu White had her own image to maintain, and it needed to match the splendor of her mansion. She would often wear a bright red wig, a tiara, diamonds on every finger, and bracelets that went halfway up her arms. Lulu White was selling a racial fantasy to her wealthy white clients. Inherent in cultural categorizations like mulatto, quadroon, and octoroon was the assumption that though octoroon women, being the whitest of all of them, possessed the socially desirable looks of whiteness, they also inherited the savagery, depravity, and sexual desires falsely ascribed to black women. So that tiny bit of blackness is what made them exciting as sexual partners. That tiny bit of blackness is what made them taboo. That tiny bit of blackness made octoroons the epitome of sexual objects. To be in step with the entire fantasy, Lulu's house had to look the part. She had to look the part. Her girls had to look the part. And she figured that with octoroons, she couldn't lose. She named Mahogany Hall an octoroon parlor, and she was thus labeled the Queen of the Octoroons. She took her business very seriously. At Mahogany Hall, you didn't just come in to pick a girl and get it on. Lulu produced and published a souvenir guide that had photos and written profiles of her prostitutes. Her guidebook described Mahogany Hall as a place where a man could enjoy 3 shots for his money: the shot upstairs, the shot downstairs, and the shot in the room. Of course, Lulu is profiled in her book. Continuing with the lies about herself, she called herself a famous West Indian octoroon. She also described herself as someone who knew her business, writing, quote, "It did not take long for her to find out what the other sex were in search of," end quote. Here's what she had to say about her workers. Quote, She has made a feature of boarding none but the fairest of girls, those gifted with nature's best charms, and would under no circumstances have any but that class in her house." End quote. And as for the photograph used for Lulu's profile, it was apparently a picture of another one of Lulu's prostitutes who was also featured in her guidebook, Victoria Hall. So Lulu's profile was just another piece of evidence that showed how she lived her life. Some fact mixed in with some fiction. Perhaps she'd be an Instagram quote-unquote model if she were alive today. Lulu produced a souvenir guidebook specifically for her brothel, but there was a well-known guide called the Blue Book that listed all of the whorehouses as well as the individual whores of Storyville. It was published annually, and it was basically like a Yellow Pages for prostitution. Business owners would pay the Blue Book to advertise products that its readers might want or need, like liquor, cigars, and cures for sexually transmitted diseases. Here is one of Lulu's listings in the Red Book, a publication that had basically the same information about the brothels of Storyville as the Blue Book, and it was the Blue Book's main competition. A full page for her house on the left. On the right, the numbers 235 for Lulu indicate the address. The street name is on the top of the page, so readers would know to visit 235 North Basin Street if they wanted to see Lulu or any of her girls listed there: Annie, Emma, Irene, or Corinne. Like the other upscale whorehouses in Storyville, Lulu's offered more than just sex. Some of the clients wanted live entertainment, dancing, and music. And at the time when jazz music was still trying to figure out what it was, Joe King Oliver played at Mahogany Hall. He was Louis Armstrong's mentor. One thing that should be made clear about Lulu White and octoroons of her time is that, given the opportunity to identify as just white, they would have. Lulu tried to, at least on one occasion when she visited a segregated racetrack. She was refused entry because she tried to enter as a white person. A local newspaper reported that, quote, "Some people take her to be colored, but she says there is not a drop of Negro blood in her veins. She says that she is West Indian and she was born in the West Indies." End quote. I wonder if Lulu had any idea just how many black people were in the West Indies when she made that statement. Anyhow, the point is that she played up the octoroon image to get money. Since she was stuck with the label, she found a way to make it pay for her pain. She turned something bad into something good. But all good things must come to an end, and Storyville is no exception to the rule. 20 years after the red light district was established, there was mounting pressure to shut it down. Some wanted a full ban on prostitution, but until they could get that, segregation would do. In 1917, legislation was proposed to officially segregate Storyville, forcing out all non-white prostitutes. A number of madams filed lawsuits to retain their properties and won unprecedented legal victories against Jim Crow laws. The final blow against Storyville came from the U.S. Navy when, under President Woodrow Wilson's leadership, America formally entered World War I. There was a naval base in the shadows of Storyville, and anything that could possibly distract soldiers from their duty was considered a threat. That included prostitutes. A federal order prohibited prostitution within 5 miles of any military base. So it ended up being the prominent Navy presence in New Orleans, not segregationists or social purists, that ended Storyville once and for all. Well, even the United States Navy's federal order didn't stop Lulu from trying to continue her sex business as usual. She had previously beat attempted murder charges, so why not take her chance with a little prostitution? After Lulu was arrested for continuing to run her whorehouse, She received a prison sentence of 1 year and 1 day. After serving only 3 months of her sentence, she applied for a pardon, citing poor health, and she was pardoned by President Woodrow Wilson himself. She returned to New Orleans and immediately started running her whorehouse again. You know the saying, there's no business like hoe business. Lulu spent the late 1910s and 1920s being arrested repeatedly on charges of running a disorderly house. She was also arrested for violating the Volstead Act, which is more commonly known as the National Prohibition Act, because she was selling liquor at her saloon that was next to her brothel. Everything that she knew how to do to make money was illegal by the 1920s. So, in 1929, Lulu White sold her magnificent mansion, Mahogany Hall, to the owner of a department store, who was said to have used it for storage. The sale of Mahogany Hall was truly the end of an era, and virtually the end of Lulu White. But thanks to Louis Armstrong, whose mentor played at Mahogany Hall, the house's name was immortalized in song, his song called Mahogany Hall Stomp. Louis Armstrong himself grew up in what was called Uptown Storyville. It was nothing like the seemingly glamorous streets of Storyville where Lulu's mansion was. It was where those working-class black people were forced to move when the prostitution district took over. It was also where the prostitutes of color relocated to work when segregation hit Storyville. As for Lulu White, after she sold Mahogany Hall in 1929, she tried to play it straight. She invested a good deal of her money into business dealings that turned sour. She lost over $150,000, surely almost all of her fortune, $2.5 million in today's money. In 1931, she died an ill and very poor woman. Almost all of Storyville was demolished in order to build the Iberville housing development that is more commonly called the Iberville Projects. Iberville was completed in 1941 and at the time opened exclusively for white, low-income residents. And where Mahogany Hall once stood in its 4-story splendor, you will find this, Basin Supermarket Seafood and Grill. It is the first floor of Mahogany Hall's adjacent saloon. The top story was destroyed by Hurricane Betsy in 1965. What's on the menu at this location now is nothing like what Lulu White was selling here in her day. But the good news is that now, whenever transactions are completed here, none of the guests will need a cure for a sexually transmitted disease.
I thought tonight.
Good gracious.
Perhaps as a reminder of my feelings for you.
Is it a
diamond? Yes. 56 carats to be exact. It was worn by Louis XVI, and they called it Le Coeur de la Mer. The heart of the ocean, yes.
She's not worth it, Cal. Give it to me. Oh, excuse me, I got a little carried away there. Bravo to Billy Zane. Takes my breath away every time, doesn't he, ladies? We know that James Cameron's Titanic story revolves around the love story of a fictional couple. The poor lad dies and the crazy old woman tosses that beautiful, exquisite piece of jewelry into the ocean instead of giving it to her granddaughter, which would have made more sense to everyone watching. We all agree with that. Now, what was the inspiration for the Heart of the Ocean, and who was wearing it? Well, the movie's design is based on the Hope Diamond. The magnificent 45-carat stone was extracted from a mine in India, and it has a history similar to the one that Cal described in the Titanic movie, though its real history is much more extensive. But there was a man on the Titanic, a second-class passenger, who gave a young woman, his traveling companion, a similar necklace. It was actually a deep blue oblong sapphire that graced the neck of his sweetheart. And sources say that this couple's story laid the groundwork for the Heart of the Ocean to make its way into the script of Titanic. It's a fascinating and scandalous story, so I'm going to tell it. His name was Henry Samuel Morley. Her name was Kate Florence Phillips. They were both from England and boarded the Titanic in Southampton. But if you look at the Titanic passenger lists, you won't see either of those names. You will see Mr. and Mrs. Henry Marshall. That was them. And they had a secret. They actually had a couple of secrets, but Henry died before learning one of them. He planned on starting a new life with Kate in America, San Francisco, California to be exact. And that alone is so romantic and so boring. The problem with Henry taking off to marry Kate was that he already had a wife in England and a child too. How messy. Just the way we like it. And the days didn't get much better for Kate as time marched on after the Titanic disaster. This is the story of an illicit love affair that never took off because fate had other plans. And Kate thought that she would be able to run off into the sunset and away from England with Mrs. Morley's husband. But an iceberg disagreed with her. Let's get into it. Henry Samuel Morley is the man of our story. He was born in Middlesex, England on May 3rd, 1873. His father, William, was a tailor. His mother, Emily, was a tailoress and gave birth to a total of 9 children, including Henry. 6 survived. Tragedy fell on the family in 1889 when Henry's father died at the beginning of the year. Henry was only 15 and took on work as a grocer's clerk. The year after his father died, Henry's mother was still listed on the 1890 census as a tailoress. Henry was still listed as a grocer's clerk, but he was also listed as a frock cutter, which suggests perhaps that he was cutting the material that his mother used to make dresses, helping her keep the family business going in his father's absence. It appears as though Henry was a hard-working young man who was dedicated to his family. 10 years later, Henry married Louisa Price and moved away from his family's home. In the early years of his marriage, he worked as a grocer's manager. Shortly after getting married, the couple welcomed their one and only child into the world, a baby girl named Doris Louisa, who was born in 1900. After baby Doris was born, the financial picture for the Morleys got a lot sweeter. That's when Henry and his brother opened a candy shop called L. Morley Brothers Confectioners. Henry was a senior partner in this family affair. The shop was making so much money that it allowed Henry to buy a home big enough for his wife and child, his mother, his Aunt Alice, and his nephew Vincent. His Aunt Alice worked as an assistant for the business. It was performing so well that Morley Brothers decided to open a second location and then a third in Birmingham. The expansion kept going. By 1911, there were a total of 8 shops under the names L. Morley Brothers Confectioners and the purveyors of high-class confectionery, and they were making high-end candy. The shop's locations were in Birmingham, Worcester, and Malvern. L. Morley Brothers Confectioners had made Henry into a rich man. He would have been a millionaire by today's standards. In addition to making Henry rich, the candy shop is also where this story starts to get messy, because Henry needed to hire some help, and he was looking for a woman to come in and give him a hand. Then in walked Kate, who was half his age and ready and willing to provide whatever service he needed. I can't believe it, but I found the want ad that Kate most likely answered, or one very similar to it, in a 1909 edition of the Gloucestershire Echo. It read, quote, "Wanted, young lady as apprentice to confectionery. Wages paid. Particulars apply L. Morley Confectioner, 336 High Street." End quote. Not a very detailed description, But whatever Henry was looking for in his next confectionery employee, Kate had it. And let's just say that from that point, the lollipops weren't the only sweet things in the candy shop that were getting Henry's attention. He had a little too much focus on the newly hired eye candy. So let's talk about her. Here's a little background information on Kate. Her full name was Kate Florence Phillips. She was a New Year's baby, born on January 1st, 1893 in Kings Norton, Birmingham, England. Her father, Thomas, was an engine fitter. Kate's mother's name was Mary. Including Kate, her parents had 5 children. They shared a house that backed onto the River Severn. At some point, her family moved. The 1911 census shows her family residing at 34 Waterworks Road, Worcester, an address that would remain important to Kate well into her adulthood. She was described as an unmarried confectionery shop assistant, employed by Henry Samuel Morley in that census report. But the census didn't keep up with the data on extramarital affairs. By the time that Kate met Henry Morley to work in his shop, she was an attractive teenager. I don't know Henry's height, but I read that he towered over Kate. I don't know her exact height, but I read that she was shorter than 5 feet tall, so I'm sure that many men towered over her. That leads me to believe that there's a good chance that Henry wasn't necessarily exceptionally tall if he towered over a woman who was not taller than 4 feet and 11 inches. Kate was also described as someone who didn't own much of anything, so she must have been surprised, flattered, and excited when she learned that her boss, the older and well-off Henry, took a liking to her. But it was more than like. Maybe it was love for Henry, maybe it was lust. Whatever it was, Henry started having sex with Kate, carrying on as if he didn't have a wife and child at home. By 1912, he was 39, and he was spending money on hotels, taking Kate to places where the two of them could engage in sexual activity. It was a different time. Today, if you book a hotel, the company will know who you are before you even pull into the parking lot. You will likely already have shared your name, driver's license number, and a credit or debit card number with your hotel brand. But in Henry's time, you could check into a hotel and give any name that you wanted at the front desk. As long as you paid your bill, no one cared. So that's how Henry was able to take his mistress wherever he wanted to have his way with her. He would give the front desk whatever name he wanted to give for himself, and Kate would simply become Mrs. whatever name he wanted to give himself. That's how he got away with it at hotels. I don't know how he got away with that at home. Maybe Henry would tell his wife that he had to go to candy-making conventions. Yeah, babe, the International Candy and Chocolate Association is doing a thing, and I gotta be there, so see you in a few days. I don't know. Or maybe Mrs. Morley would turn a blind eye to his cheating. Like I said, he was practically a millionaire. And if his wife chose to not acknowledge his cheating, she wouldn't have been the first wife of a rich man to shut her mouth in exchange for a comfortable lifestyle. Whatever it was, love or lust or a little bit of both, it didn't take long for it to get serious in Henry's mind, because he started making plans, lifelong plans for himself and Kate. He wanted to marry Kate, but he was going to have to keep it a bit of a secret because of Louisa, that pesky problem at home, his wife, the old ball and chain, getting in the way of him and his sweet young thing. You know how it goes, right, fellas? Wives. What are you going to do about them? Don't kill me, ladies, I'm just kidding. But seriously, Henry had an entire plan worked out for an elopement, and he started putting the pieces in motion. First, he sold his shares in his confectionery shops so that he and Kate would have money to live on, and so he'd have capital for his next business venture. His plan was to move with Kate to San Francisco, California. There, he would start a new confectionery business. He also used some of the money to buy his sweetheart an engagement present, It was a diamond-encrusted sapphire necklace. Well, I shouldn't say that he merely bought it. He had it specially made for Kate in Birmingham's jewelry quarter. It was an expensive piece with a name, L'amour de la mer, the love of the ocean. I'm sure that you recall the one in James Cameron's Titanic was called Le Coeur de la Mer, the heart of the ocean. Henry used some more of his money to purchase a joint ticket for himself and Kate to get to the United States. It was ticket number 250655, a second-class ticket on the Titanic, which cost him £26. Henry did his best to plan every detail down to the T because he needed to make a clean getaway. He could not risk getting his good name dirty while he snuck off to do something dirty. And he was going to need a little help to pull off everything. So he decided to tell one person what his real plans were. He told his brother, Arthur. Henry told everyone else a completely different story. Henry had been rather ill in the months before the Titanic's maiden voyage. And while we could probably all agree that there's never really a right time to be sick, the timing of Henry's illness was rather convenient because it gave him an alibi or an out for his escape plan. While his brother, Arthur, knew that Henry was leaving the country to start a new life with Kate, Henry told his wife and the rest of his family that he was leaving England to go to San Francisco to recuperate from his illness. That's right. According to his doctor, as he told everyone, the warmer climate would help him to recover more quickly. He would need to leave for 6 months, and then he would be in tip-top shape, and he'd be ready to come back home. Who was his doctor? Marvin Gaye? Because it's so clear that the only healing Henry was in search of was sexual healing. His brother, Arthur, had a little more to say about Henry's plans, but we'll get there. On March 2nd, 1912, Henry withdrew £400 from the United Counties Bank Limited and pretended to be a good little husband and father until it was time to set sail from Southampton aboard the Ship of Dreams on April 10th, 1912, shortly after noon. Henry was abandoning his family forever. But forevers don't always last a long time, do they? April 10th was a new day and a world away from what Henry and Kate had known. That was the day that the couple eloped together on the Titanic, full of hope, with their new life ahead of them. What had started out in a candy shop as a clandestine affair between Henry Morley and Kate Phillips had transformed into a serious relationship on the Titanic between Mr. and Mrs. Marshall, the fake names on their tickets. Like so many of the other passengers who boarded the Wonder ship, Henry and Kate exchanged their ticket for entry onto the vessel, then waved their goodbyes to the lookers-on. Among those waving them off on the quay was Henry's brother, Arthur, the only person in the crowd who knew their dirty little secret. According to Henry's great-granddaughter, Arthur is the one who drove the couple to Southampton so that they could make their escape. He was especially instrumental in their plan. Arthur kept his lips tight, and Henry and Kate were so thankful for it. But there would come a time when Kate would hope that Arthur would reverse that favor and speak on this adulterous relationship, and we'll get there. Now we're on the Titanic. And I'm sure that the mere sight of the ship blew Kate away. She was from a working-class family and would never have seen such luxury and splendor before, even in second class. As has often been said of Titanic, second class on Titanic was first class on any other vessel. Henry certainly could have afforded first-class tickets for himself and Kate, but his fear was that traveling in first class would have drawn too much attention. Nevertheless, the couple had everything that they needed to start their new life merrily, right in their second-class accommodation. Second-class staterooms were very comfortable and pretty. They featured oak paneling, glossy white linoleum floors, and mahogany furniture, which, in addition to their double beds, consisted of a large sofa, a wardrobe, and a dressing table with a wash basin, mirror, and storage shelves. Their bed linen was changed daily by a ship's steward. Now, the part that we might not think of as luxurious today would have been their bathroom facilities. Though second class on Titanic was pleasant, second-class bathroom facilities were shared. They were communal lavatories that may have been shared with passengers from 8 different cabins, and if Henry or Kate or any second-class passengers wanted to take a bath on their voyage, they could, if they made their request with the steward and scheduled it. Hey, it was second class. Not as luxurious as first class, but way better off than their fellow passengers below in third class, who only had access to 1 bathtub for women and 1 for men, for all of the 709 passengers in third class. Can you imagine having to share 1 bathtub with hundreds of people for days? Worse yet, can you imagine being the crew member responsible for keeping those areas clean? Well, there was one thing that the third-class passengers had that the first and second-class passengers did not have. It's something that we might consider a convenience today, and that's automatically flushing toilets. Now, this wasn't because White Star Line wanted to do something special for its poorest customers. Their reasoning was that most third-class passengers did not have indoor plumbing at home and would either not have known or remembered to flush the toilets after using them. If Kate would have had to pay her own way to get on the Titanic, she surely would have been in third class. But she didn't. She was having a grand time with Henry, where as second-class passengers, they also would have had access to a smoking room, an enormous outdoor promenade, and a library where their afternoon tea and coffee were served. They also had a well-appointed dining room that could seat at least 2,400 people, and, to add to its upscale ambiance, a pianist would play to entertain the diners while they feasted on food that was often from the same menu as first-class passengers. In this day and age, it was normal on luxury ships for the first and second-class passengers to have a lavish 5-day party. On Titanic, they only had a 4-day party, because, as we know, the voyage was cut short. Kate, as you recall, was described as a young woman who didn't have much of her own. So there's no doubt that her 4 days on the Titanic were the most lavish of her life. And Henry was so in love with her and would have had enough money to see to it that she had all of the proper dresses and outfits that Kate needed so that she could be a part of all of the festivities without missing a beat. Women spent months planning their wardrobes for trips like these. Traveling across the Atlantic on a luxury liner was a big deal, and it was an even bigger deal on the Titanic just because it was the Titanic. But you know how it is. Even these days when we go on an exciting vacation, many of us plan way ahead for what we want to wear. We think about the photos that we want to take and how the outfit will look at the whatever landmark. In 1912, those women shared that same kind of excitement, but there were more rules about what they had to wear on the ships and when. The first and second class ladies would change 4 times a day. For that reason, many of them would bring their maids. Off-the-rack clothing for women wouldn't be popular until another 15 to 20 years. Women were still wearing corsets and would have needed some help getting into those corsets. We know that Kate didn't have a maid, and Henry didn't hire one for the voyage, so I'm sure that it's a safe bet that Henry was helping Kate put her clothes on and take them off. For Kate and the rest of the ladies in second and first class, the first outfit of the day was a suit for breakfast. The second was a tea gown for afternoon tea. Then at night, there was a different evening dress for each day of the voyage. On April 14th, just a few hours before Titanic struck the iceberg, Kate would have slipped into one of her fine evening dresses and dined on some of these menu items from the second-class menu from that night that we happen to have here. Maybe she and Henry enjoyed some consommé tapioca, curried chicken and rice, pureed turnips, and coconut sandwiches for dessert. Titanic's second-class menus had some delicious options. And finally, after that filling, appetizing meal, A nightgown for retiring to bed would have been Kate's fourth change of the day as a lady in second class. And on April 14th, that would be Kate's final outfit change on her Titanic trip. But of course, she had no way of knowing that. Kate was floating on cloud 9. This man for whom she was working changed her life and her economic status by proposing marriage to her. He promised her a comfortable life in America, and she had every reason to believe that what he promised would come true, because so far it had. She saw all of the planning and scheming that Henry had done to make their dream become a reality. She was in on all of it. Their plan had to work, for if anyone back home in England found out what they were up to, both Henry and Kate would have to live the rest of their lives as scandals, social pariahs. It would have been even worse for Kate because a woman was supposed to be respectable. A man would have been given some grace because he was a man. Like, how could he resist the wiles of a 19-year-old vixen? But Henry and Kate's scheme stopped working as soon as the Titanic stopped floating. After 4 extravagant, fun-filled days, the ship that was called the Unsinkable would sink. On April 14th, at 11:40 p.m., Titanic struck an iceberg. Henry knew that it was something serious straight away. We know that many Titanic passengers felt that same shift in the boat and did not take it seriously or allow themselves to feel comfort in the assurance that they were on an unsinkable ship. Well, Henry did the opposite. He told Kate to wake up. She, as we know, was wearing only her nightgown. He also was wearing his night clothes. After she put slippers on her feet, he took her up to the boat deck to get her loaded onto a lifeboat. After striking the berg, Titanic's designer Thomas Andrews surveyed the damage and correctly predicted that the ship had only about 1 or 2 hours to float before sinking. Then it was midnight, April 15th. The crew members readied the lifeboats for launch. Just days before, the Unsinkable had made the news all over the world, with stories boasting about her maiden voyage. This was the ship that everyone wanted to get a ticket to board. But now, at midnight, the real prize was a way off of this boat. And with lifeboat space for only 1,178 of its 2,240 passengers, you can bet that a seat in the standard lifeboat was far more envied than a first-class cabin on the Ship of Dreams. Isn't that funny how quickly things can change in this life? Literally just minutes before Titanic was the ship that everyone wanted to be on. Just moments after midnight, only the lucky ones would be able to get off. Well, Henry's instincts were correct, as we know. The passengers had no way of knowing, but by 12:15 a.m., Captain Smith had ordered the Marconi operators to send out a distress signal. And though by the time the Titanic sailed, SOS had become the official distress signal, the operators sent both SOS and CQD calls. CQ signified a general call, and the D stood for distress. Many ships still used CQD, and the Titanic operators needed everyone on the receiving ends of their signals to understand that it was an emergency. They could not leave anything to chance. A number of vessels got the signal but were just too far away to respond. Then, at 12:20 a.m., the RMS Carpathia received from Titanic, "Come at once. We have struck a berg. It's a CQD, old man." The Carpathia was a Cunard liner, and Cunard was White Star Line's biggest competitor at sea. Thankfully, none of that mattered when they received Titanic's distress signal. Carpathia's captain was Arthur Henry Rostron. Arthur and Henry, Kate's boss and his brother's names. Anyway, he immediately changed the course of Carpathia to aid Titanic. It was 58 nautical miles away. too far to reach Titanic before she was predicted to sink. It would take Carpathia about 4 hours to reach the distressed ship. Titanic would be underwater by then, but some help was better than no help. Meanwhile, the first distress rocket was fired at 12:45 a.m. So, anyone who didn't know or didn't understand that the bump in the night that they felt was serious business now likely got the message. Passengers were starting to line up, waiting to enter lifeboats. They were entertained by Titanic's 8-man band, led by Wallace Hartley. The musicians were initially playing in the first-class lounge when the voyage was going as planned, but after Captain Smith issued orders to evacuate, the band moved out to the boat deck. And I said that the passengers were entertained by them, but it is more likely that the frantic passengers were calmed by the band. They played for those who were entering lifeboats and for the others who knew that their fate was to go down with the ship. None of the musicians would survive the sinking. Now, even though Henry and Kate were among the first to get to the boat deck, it appears that Kate was among the last to actually get into a lifeboat. Titanic historians, for the most part, agree that she got on lifeboat number 11, which launched from the starboard side at 1:45 a.m. A few sources say that she got on lifeboat number 13, but if the majority of the sources have it right, and she was on number 11, only one more lifeboat and 3 collapsibles would leave Titanic after this point. You might be wondering what took Kate so long to get on a lifeboat if she was, in fact, one of the first people lined up to get on one. The answer to that seems to be that Henry didn't want to let her go. It was after the trek from their cabin to the boat deck when Henry placed Kate's beautiful L'amour de la mer necklace on her neck one last time. Reportedly, he gave it to her on the first day of the voyage, and she wore it every night at dinner with one of her gowns. It was meant to be a precursor of even more stunning, expensive presents to come, just to show her a taste of what life was going to be like for her once they got settled in San Francisco, once Henry had his new candy shop up and running. But at this point, when it was clear to everyone the Titanic was going down, the beautiful necklace was looking more like a goodbye gift. After Henry placed the piece on Kate's neck, he clung tightly to her. He did not want to let her go, and if it had been up to him, he would not have let her go. But crew members grabbed Kate and threw her into a lifeboat. Henry had just enough time to steal a kiss. There was no time for long, sad goodbyes. People were scrambling for their lives. Now, Kate was safely floating away from Titanic in Lifeboat 11, wearing only her robe, slippers, and sapphire and diamond necklace, and holding a small sealskin purse. Kate was freezing, but she was safe. And that was more than could be said for Henry Morley. She didn't know it at that time, but that kiss that he gave her on the boat deck would be the last one that he would ever give her. Henry did not make his way into a lifeboat. Henry could not swim. He either drowned or froze to death in the icy waters of the Atlantic in the wee hours of April 15th, 1912. As Henry's lifeless body joined the other 1,500 fatalities, Kate remained afloat on Lifeboat 11, waiting to be rescued. The reality was that her lover, who was going to change her life, was gone forever. But what Kate didn't know at that time was that her love of the ocean necklace wasn't the only piece of Henry that was still with her. We'll get there. But first, we had to lay Henry to rest. It will be easy enough for us, but it was an emotionally difficult task for his family because his body, like so many other Titanic victims, was never recovered. Or if it was recovered, it was never identified and claimed by his family. Henry's death, while indeed sorrowful, was also a complication for the people he left behind. For starters, his brother Arthur had to come clean about knowing Henry's plan. but he only told as much as he needed to tell, as is evidenced by a small article in the Birmingham Post dated April 22nd, 1912. Here are the details that are laid out. Word reached Birmingham, England on April 20th that Henry was one of the victims of the Titanic disaster. His brother, Arthur, accompanied him to Southampton and watched him leave on the ship. And his brother really stuck to the script that Henry wrote before leaving. He told the paper that Henry left England to go to California in order to get well from a bout of sickness. Arthur also added that he had made a suggestion to his brother to take a German liner to Galveston, Texas, instead of taking the Titanic to New York. He said that he made this suggestion because he thought that a longer sea voyage might benefit his brother's health more. Now, we know that the Morley brothers were in on this plan together, and Henry wasn't leaving home because of his health, unless being sick of not having sex with a woman younger than your wife is a health risk. It might be. I'm not a doctor. But I wonder, if Arthur really did make this suggestion to Henry, did he do it because there would have been an even smaller chance that he would bump into someone on the ship who knew him? That's my guess. What do you think about that? Anyway, the brief article also stated that Henry left behind a widow and one child. Now that's not a lie, but it's not the entire truth. Henry left behind a widow, a child, and a fiancé, and maybe more. Before we get back to that fiancé, I have to point out that on the same page as this article about Henry's death is what was said to be the official list of survivors. Now, this was only a week after the sinking, and it's very clear that this list is incomplete and incorrect. I can tell at a glance because Madeline Astor's name is not on it. But something else stands out to me. Mr. and Mrs. Marshall are listed as survivors. And so is Miss Katie Marshall, but Katie Phillips does not appear on this list. They booked their tickets as Mr. and Mrs. Marshall. So it appears that there's a chance that Henry's alias is shown to be a survivor on the same news page where his death is covered. Yes, Marshall is a common enough name, but Kate was booked as his wife, so she wouldn't have been Miss Marshall. But Kate and Katie are very similar names. It looks like there was definitely some confusion going on there. There was another small mix-up with Henry using the fake name of Mr. Marshall. The Brooklyn Daily Eagle reported it on April 20th, 1912. On what appears to be basically the sports page. At the time the Titanic sailed, the chess champion of the United States was Mr. Frank J. Marshall. He had been in Europe that spring. When his mother saw that there was a Mr. Marshall on the list of missing passengers, she panicked because she knew that her son was planning on returning home that same month, April. She just didn't know when. But chess lovers all around the world were able to take a sigh of relief. It was just Henry Marshall, not the famous chess player. Quick question that has absolutely nothing to do with the Titanic. How do you feel about chess being written about in the sports section? Is chess a sport? I mean, they show the spelling bee on ESPN. There are a few activities that blur the line between sport and skilled hobby, in my opinion. Race car driving, bowling, golf. Like, if you can do it really well and still not be an athlete, like if you can do it while drinking a beer and smoking a cigar, is it really a sport? Is it a sport if the person who's doing it is not an athlete? I'm curious to see your opinions. Golf is debatable, but chess is not a sport. I'm sorry. But back to Kate. To say that her scheme was not going as planned was an understatement. Here she was, 19 years old, stranded at sea in her nightgown, slippers, and a beautiful necklace. She and her fellow passengers were in Lifeboat 11 in the freezing air for hours. Thankfully for her, one of Titanic's crew members gave her his jacket for some warmth. She would have desperately needed it. The air temperature was just below 32 degrees Fahrenheit at the time of the collision. I can't imagine spending even 10 minutes in that kind of coldness in only my nightgown. At 3:30 a.m., the welcoming sounds and sights of Carpathia's rockets showed up to the area. I'm sure that Kate and her fellow Titanic survivors were relieved, but they weren't in the clear just yet. The first lifeboat to reach Carpathia was lifeboat number 2. That was at 4:10 a.m., and it would take several hours for Carpathia to pick up the rest of the survivors. On April 18th, the Carpathia arrived in New York, and even though it was late at night and raining, massive crowds were there waiting to greet the survivors. Carpathia carried 705 of Titanic's survivors to New York. Lifeboat space for less than half of them. And because of how sparingly those lifeboats were loaded, less than a third of them survived. And Kate was one of them, one of those survivors of the tragedy within a tragedy. She didn't know anything except that the life that she had planned with Henry went down with that ship. She thought that she would reach the shores of America and then her life would be set. If she knew one thing for certain about Henry, it's that he knew how to make a lot of money at his candy business. She was supposed to step off of the Titanic and have it made. Now, she didn't have a clue. Kate was in an extremely vulnerable position. She was taken in and cared for by the American Red Cross in New York City. After leaving the shelter of the Red Cross facilities, Kate was fortunate enough to meet a couple who took pity on her condition and took her into their home to care for her. And she needed the help. She was back down to nothing. Economically, the same position that she was in before she met Henry. Maybe a little worse. She left the Titanic with nothing more than her nightgown, slippers, and a jacket that belonged to someone else. But she also had that little sealskin purse. It contained the keys to her second-class cabin and the keys to her trunk that she packed for her voyage to America. At this point, 2 useless sets of keys. But that purse also contained the stunning sapphire and diamond necklace that Henry had given her. That necklace was starting to look more like something that she would have to pawn for money rather than something that she would get to enjoy for the rest of her life. She had fallen on hard times. But thankfully for Kate, a little bit of financial assistance was on the way thanks to a man named Ernest P. Bignell. In his capacity as director of the American Red Cross, he had set up the Titanic Relief Fund. It was just over $160,000 that he had raised to support Titanic widows and orphans. From this fund, Kate received some desperately needed clothing and $300. That $300 had the buying power of about $9,400 today in 2024, so it was a good amount of support for her situation. And soon, Kate was going to see just how much she really needed this money. You see, about 4 months after staying with the couple who took her in, Kate noticed that her clothes, even her new clothes, weren't fitting as well as they once had. It was as if they had shrunk in the clothing dryer. But it was 1912, and she didn't have a damn clothing dryer. People wouldn't really have those for another 50 years. I told you earlier that we would get back to that British newspaper that said that Henry left behind a wife and daughter. Well, it turned out that Henry had given Kate one more gift. He left behind 2 daughters, one with his wife and a very new one with Kate. Yes, Kate was pregnant. It is thought that Kate conceived on the Titanic. Luxury travel accommodations might make some women throw caution to the wind, more so than a normal day at home, so I won't judge Kate. But the couple who took her in did judge her, and told her that they did not feel comfortable with the idea of boarding a pregnant single woman. They told Kate that she had to leave. So you can see that that relief check came in right on time. Kate had to make new plans. She was only 19 years old, The only time that she had left home was to go away with Henry to America. Her only thought was to do what made sense to her, and that was to go back home to England. And she did. She made travel arrangements to return on another White Star liner, the Adriatic. Now, I gotta say, I do wonder why Henry didn't give Kate any money when he saw her off on the lifeboat. Maybe he thought that he would survive the disaster, or maybe he just didn't think about money in the middle of the panic. Either way, she really could have used that money that he took out of his bank before he got on the Titanic. Nevertheless, she was on her way back home, sailing back across the Atlantic. And by the way, I really applaud any Titanic survivor who could muster up the courage to get on another ship after living through that disaster. I frankly don't know how they were able to make it to New York on the Carpathia without needing to be sedated, but I do understand that Kate had to do what she needed to do in order to get home. But I am surprised that she, or any Titanic survivor, ever booked with White Star Line again. I would have at least wanted to cruise with Cunard, the company that rescued me. Nevertheless, that was Kate's decision. She was going back home on yet another White Star luxury liner. A quick bit of trivia about the Adriatic: it was the first ocean liner to feature a swimming pool. We can only imagine the emotions that Kate was experiencing on her journey home. If she ever had planned on returning home, it wasn't supposed to be like this, with no husband, no real future, and a baby in her belly. A married man's baby at that. She left London as a secret and returned as a scandal. Now, I'm jumping ahead of the story just a little here, but you already know that Kate had a child on the way, so I'm going to share with you what her daughter said about her mother returning home while she was pregnant with her daughter. Quote, "She was pregnant with a married man's child. If you were a single mother in those days, some people thought you were mentally retarded." End quote. Now, retarded isn't a word that we really use today, but people did think that something was wrong with Kate, and eventually, something was very wrong with the way that she was thinking and behaving. We'll get there. For now, we have to get Kate back home. She returned to her parents' small house in Worcester, visibly pregnant. She was unmarried and therefore a disgrace. This was 1912. And though seeing a single mother today is a fairly common occurrence, back then it wasn't. These days, many women choose to have a child without being married to the child's father. Sometimes it's not a choice for the mother, and some fathers do choose to walk away. Some women are artificially inseminated. But whatever the reasons may be, it's now fairly common to see single mothers. Kate was ahead of her time in the worst way, though. It was bad enough that she was an unwed mother. But to add to her shame, her child's father had been a married man. The story eventually got out around town that Kate had eloped with Henry Morley and was pregnant with his child. Then, exactly 9 months after Kate and Henry boarded the Titanic, a baby girl was born in Kate's parents' home, the same one listed on the 1911 census when she started working for Henry. On January 11th, 1913, Kate named her Ellen Mary Phillips because she did not have the legal right to name her Ellen Mary Morley. In Ellen's own words, "It was a disgrace to be born without a father." Here she was, an object of shame, and she hadn't done anything but be born. And Kate balled up all of her grief, shame, and longing for the future that should have been with the love of her life, Henry, and took it out on that innocent baby girl and became the worst mother imaginable. There were two good things that Kate did for her daughter, though one of them didn't really amount to anything and it turned into something negative. That was that Kate fought to have Henry Morley recognized as her daughter's father. She wanted his name on her daughter's birth certificate. That would have legitimized baby Ellen and possibly entitled the child to some of the money that her father left behind. But the fulfillment of this request would never come to fruition during Kate's lifetime, leaving Ellen to keep the fight going throughout her entire adult life. For Kate, even bringing up this argument was a negative because it left a blemish on her own character. Whether anyone wanted to believe her or not, the fact was that by insisting that Henry was baby Ellen's father, Kate was also admitting that she had had a sexual affair with a married man, a man who everyone knew she knew was married. So you can imagine that people were talking around town. Was this little girl Henry's baby? Was Kate telling the truth? How could anyone trust a harlot who admitted to sleeping with her married boss? Kate started the campaign to have Henry's name placed on her baby's birth certificate as soon as she got home. As she was marching on with her fight, Henry's family had their own pressing matter to deal with: Henry's will. If Kate could have gotten just someone to choose her side, she could have some money set aside for her daughter before she was born. Good old brother Arthur was the executor of what was left of Henry's fortune. It was 1,136 pounds. According to the CPI inflation calculator for the UK, that's a little over 160,000 pounds today. That's roughly 200,000 USD for my fellow Americans. Definitely not enough money to live on without having to work, especially when we take into consideration that that amount was divided amongst Henry's creditors and family members. But even a fraction of the estate would have been a help to Kate. And, after all of the math was done, at the end of September in 1912, just months before Kate was due to deliver the baby, Arthur came up with a nice round figure to give Kate from the will. 0. It doesn't get any rounder than that. We know that Kate was only trying to do what was best for her daughter, and if we're being honest, she was trying to make her own life a little easier too by lightening her financial load. But that just didn't work out. She was starting to learn just how tough life was going to be as a single mother in 1912. People talked, and nobody had anything good to say about a young, sneaky husband stealer. Henry and Kate, with their narrow-minded decision-making, had created some difficult pathways forward for everyone to navigate. How do you think you would have handled this situation if you were one of Henry's close family members and Kate needed your help? If Kate had come to you and said, "I'm sorry for trying to run off to America with Henry, but will you please allow me to put his name on my daughter's birth certificate and give me some money?" Do you think that you would have told her yes if you were Henry's brother? What if you were Henry's wife? I mean, she had to have known the truth. They all knew. One Wednesday morning, neither one of them shows up at work. Or ever again. If Henry was ready to run off and marry Kate and leave home in such a sloppy way, he was likely talking about her way too much to his family and friends. Way more than he did about his other employees. Can you picture him telling his wife things like, "Kate's so young and already so smart at, candy. I can't wait to see her at work tomorrow, babe." Anyway, the other good deed that Kate performed on the behalf of her daughter was more beneficial. Even though it may sound cruel, and Kate's intentions behind it didn't necessarily have her daughter at the forefront of her mind, and that is that she left her daughter behind shortly after giving birth to her. Kate left baby Ellen to be reared by Kate's mother and father. While it's sad to think of a child not having the love of her mother, Kate's parents' house was the best place that Ellen could have been. And for a little more than the first decade of her life, that's where she was. Ellen thought that her grandparents were her mother and father, because Kate would only come to visit the child occasionally, but Ellen never knew that Kate was her mother. Thankfully for Ellen, her grandparents doted on her and she grew up in a loving environment. And Ellen loved her grandparents. Her grandfather, Kate's father, was still working at a job that brought in a decent wage, and Ellen's grandmother, Kate's mother, stayed at home. She made Ellen's dresses, which Ellen thought were beautiful. and Ellen's grandparents sent her to a private convent school. By the way, it was Henry's brother, Arthur, who paid for Ellen's education. This was 100% an acknowledgement that Henry was Ellen's father. The Morley family could never publicly admit it, but they definitely knew the truth. Reportedly, Ellen looked a lot like Henry, so much that it probably seemed silly to deny their relation. But the young Ellen didn't know anything about that paternity mess. Ellen called her grandparents Mum and Dad. As far as she knew, they were her parents. Kate left Ellen with her parents so that she could go off and start a new life for herself in London. But sometimes she would drop in and visit her daughter. Here's how those visits went, according to Kate's daughter, Ellen. Quote, "Sometimes she would come for a visit, but of course I didn't know who she was. She would sweep in, hug me tightly, make a fuss of me, then leave again. For some reason, I didn't like it and dreaded her visits. It wasn't until much later that I found out who she really was." End quote. Ellen's days with her grandparents were filled with love and laughter. They had a family punt. That's a long, narrow, flat-bottomed boat that's square at both ends and propelled with a long pole, kind of like a canoe. Some days they would take the punt out on the river. There was a special seat for Ellen, in which her grandparents would strap her really tight. Her grandfather would always say, while they were out enjoying their river outings, quote, "We'll make sure you don't drown," end quote. It was a joke that Ellen didn't understand. She wouldn't understand what it meant until she was a teenager. Apparently, whatever plans Kate had made for herself in London were not working for her. She wasn't able to make the money that she needed to provide for herself, let alone a child. Then, in walked Arthur Morley back into Kate's life. He was Ellen's uncle, though he would never say it publicly. He stepped up to offer Kate a little financial help, on the condition that she took her daughter into her own care. The money was to help Ellen. It only went into Kate's hands because she was her mother. It was Arthur's way of offering child support to aid his niece. The deal that Arthur extended to Kate was that if she took custody of her daughter, he would pay her £1 per week. Kate needed the money desperately, so she went to her parents and collected her child. As Ellen saw it, quote, "She took me away from my grandparents when I was 12. It was a dreadful experience," end quote. Now, this is just an observation, but 12 was also the age of Henry's daughter with his wife when Kate took him away from his family. And I'm just saying took him away as an expression. I 100% understand that Henry was a grown man and Kate did not make him do anything that he didn't want to do. But still, it's sad that both of his daughters experienced trauma surrounding their change of parental circumstances at the same age of 12. The day that Kate took custody of Ellen, Ellen's life was changed, and not for the better. She said that her mother was always cruel to her, and she remembered the nasty words that came out of Kate's mouth as soon as they left her grandparents' house. They were, "You're no longer a lady now, madam." My goodness. The sweet life that Ellen had known with her grandparents all of a sudden came to a screeching halt as soon as Kate got her hands on her daughter. According to Ellen, Kate had nothing but scorn and bitterness to give her. She never had one kind word to say to her daughter. The beautiful clothes that Ellen's grandmother had made for her, Kate replaced them with coarse black stockings and boots. She would often hit Ellen, beating her legs with a stick. And this punishment would last for days at a time and was probably the most disgusting thing that I read about what Kate would do to Ellen. I want you to hear it in Ellen's words. Quote, "Sometimes she would lock me up in a cupboard for days with just a pot in there to use as a toilet." End quote. Can you imagine your own mother doing this to you? Beating you and leaving you in the dark for days, with nothing but a pot to use for you to relieve yourself? Disgusting. And a lot of those punishments were handed down to Ellen for simply looking like her father. That's what she had done wrong. Just existed and looked like the man who helped to create her. For years, Ellen's days were filled with misery, compliments of her mother. Now, I'm going to add some more quotes from Ellen as we go on with this story, but I want to make it clear to you that I have been doing that earlier in this story before I let you know that she was born. I love you as viewers and listeners of my content, and I know that some of you do your own research, buy the books that are listed in my sources, and even pause the screen to read the articles that I display in my videos. That being said, there are times when most sources revealed a detail contrary to what Ellen said. In those moments, I have deferred to Ellen's recollection since she would have heard the story firsthand from her mother. But I will let you know what the other sources say so that you can decide for yourself or do your own research to draw your own conclusion. So far, there have been minor details that don't affect the course of this story. For instance, some sources say that Kate returned to England on the Celtic, but Ellen said that it was the Adriatic, so I went with that. I just trust that she remembered what her mother told her, and she would have no motive to change the story. I also got from Ellen the detail regarding why it took so long for Kate to get on a lifeboat, being because, as she retold it, that Henry clung to her and refused to let her go. But back to Kate and Ellen. Kate's relatives and friends said that she was never the same after returning home from the disaster. And I don't think that we would expect any person who survived Titanic to be the same person that they were before such a horror. But that didn't excuse Kate's abuse of her daughter. After Kate had given up on the fight to have Ellen legally recognized as Henry's child, she rarely spoke of him. That's understandable. I'm sure that thoughts of him were a source of pain for her. But what is not understandable or justified in any way is the pain that she caused her child just because Henry was gone. It wasn't Ellen's fault. Kate treated her daughter like she was a servant or even worse, a slave. Ellen's teenage years were filled with orders and beatings from her mother, and Kate only told Ellen about her father during a fit of rage after Ellen raised her voice to her mother after being fed up with her demands. Here's how that happened. Kate actually found a man who wanted to marry her. When she moved to London to find work, she got a job as a saleswoman, selling shoes and hats. That was when she met Frederick Watson. He owned a window cleaning business. Here is where I have to admit that I'm confused on the timeline because Ellen doesn't provide one. It's clear from Ellen's account that Frederick Watson witnessed the abuse that Kate inflicted upon Ellen. In her story, Frederick later opens a cafe, and she, Ellen, works for him there. Ellen's version makes it seem as if Frederick married her mother after Kate took custody of her. But according to Encyclopedia Titanica, Frederick married Kate in 1918, and then Kate took custody of Ellen 4 years later. And that same source also says that Frederick and Kate had their own daughter before Ellen was added to their family. Again, I'm letting you know what the other sources say, but for the sake of our story, I will defer to Ellen's story. Some details in Ellen's story just don't fit in with what the other sources say. Ellen refers to her stepfather as a kind man, so I don't think that he would have stood by and watched her be abused for several years. By the timeline of other sources, he would have. And it doesn't make sense to me that if Kate was married to a business owner, that she would have needed money from Arthur in exchange for taking care of her own daughter. So I'm just going to go back to Ellen's story, and I hope that you understand why. It simply makes more sense, even though the timeline is incomplete. So, back to Frederick's cafe. There were living quarters above the cafe where Frederick, Kate, and Ellen lived. Whenever Kate needed something, she would bang on the floor, which was the ceiling of the cafe. That was Ellen's signal that her mother needed something, and Ellen needed to quickly see how she could serve her mother. Ellen hated it, especially on the days that the cafe was really busy with customers. Well, on one busy day, she just couldn't take it anymore. Kate started beating on the floor to get Ellen's attention, and Ellen stormed up to Kate's room. According to Ellen, this is what happened, quote, "I said, 'Why don't you just put your head under the covers and die?' She looked at me in terror and said, 'Don't look at me that way. That's how your father looked at me the night he said goodbye to me on the Titanic.' That was the first real information I ever had about him. Up until then, I hardly knew a thing." End quote. So that is how Ellen learned about her father. But thankfully for her, she had a stepfather who cared for her. He did not approve of the way that Ellen abused Kate, so he did something about it. He reported Kate's physical and mental abuse of Ellen to legal authorities. His report prompted an investigation into Kate. The findings eventually led to a court order being filed against Kate, his own wife, to stop abusing her daughter. Ellen said that Frederick was a wonderful man who saved her life because of the way he stepped in on her behalf. After that court ruling, Kate gave up on life. It was as if abusing her daughter was the only thing that she lived for. Shortly after being ordered to not physically abuse her daughter, Kate took to her bed and never got out of it again. Frederick took all that he could from Kate before he finally got fed up and eventually abandoned her. This was around the time that a 16-year-old Ellen received the Love of the Ocean necklace from her mother. This is how she recalled it, quote, "When I was 16, my mother gave me a diamond and sapphire necklace and a sealskin purse with 2 keys inside. She simply gave them to me with the words, 'Here, take these, they're yours now.'" End quote. After that, Kate's mental condition continued to worsen. It got so bad that she even attempted ending her own life on multiple occasions. The method of one of her attempts was swallowing acid. She survived, but to no one's surprise, the acid burned the walls of her stomach. After Frederick left Kate, Ellen was practically an adult and able to run her own life. She made the decision for herself and her mental and physical health to move away from Kate. What poetic irony that Kate, who was perfectly comfortable with the man of her dreams, abandoning his wife and daughter to be with her, would spend the rest of her life abandoned by her own husband and daughter. And poor Ellen, she continued the fight that her mother had started before she was born, the fight to have Henry Morley's name put on her birth certificate. Ellen never stopped fighting to be recognized as Henry's daughter. But she didn't let that battle overshadow her entire life. She lived a little. She found a new job working as a florist. Later, she moved on from that position and worked for the London Passport Office. And Ellen got married. In 1935, when she was 22, she married a teacher named Lawrence Farmer. Later that same year, they had a son together. His name was Robert. Well, a few years after this little family got its start, they would be broken up because World War II started and Lawrence had to go away to serve his country and fight. This is where Ellen allowed her mother's bad example to guide her life. She shamefully had a sexual affair while Lawrence was on the front lines in the trenches fighting for king and country. That's right. Before her husband came home, Ellen was in bed with a new man, a bus driver named Frederick Walker. Well, of course Lawrence didn't want for his son to be reared by this other man and, in his mind now, his whorish wife. So he took Ellen to court for custody of little Robert. And Lawrence won. After gaining custody of his son, Lawrence sued Ellen for divorce, and he won his divorce as well. Maybe that made Ellen feel like a winner, because after getting divorced, she did what she wanted to do anyway. And what she wanted to do was marry Frederick, and she did in 1944. Now here she was, kind of following her mother's footsteps, having an affair and losing custody of her child. Speaking of her mother, Kate, with no one left to care for her, was put into an insane asylum, and that is where her story ended. Most sources say that Kate's final ending came in 1964, but Ellen says that her mother died in 1958, alone in the asylum. By that time, Ellen had been apart from her mother for years and only saw Kate's death as a blessing. She didn't even know when it happened exactly. She was told months later by an aunt. Ellen turned out to be a lot more like her mother than she'd ever hoped to. As an adult, she never forgave her mother, but she understood her. Kate abused Ellen because, in Ellen's words, she was the embodiment of Kate's troubles, and Kate just couldn't get over it. Fast forward to 1989. Ellen was still fighting to have Henry's name put on her birth certificate. By this time, she was 76 years old. She got a special treat that year. It wasn't the treat for which she had been fighting for decades, but it was something that was almost just as sweet. Mike Grundy, who was a columnist for the Worcester News, had run a story about 3 men who died on the Titanic. One of those men was Ellen's father, Henry. And Mike Grundy presented to Ellen the photograph of Henry that he was going to use in his story. In his words, "When I handed her a photo of her father, she cried." That was Ellen's first time seeing her father's face in a clear photo. The following decade was not kind to Ellen at all. In the 1990s, she was living in Perthshire and had become an elderly woman who had fallen on hard times financially. In a moment of desperation, she did something that she never thought she would have to do. For most of her life, she had in her possession that same little sealskin purse that Kate had when she left the Titanic. In that purse had always been the keys to her parents' cabin and Kate's sapphire and diamond necklace. The content of that purse went from being a family heirloom to fast cash in an instant when Ellen found a buyer, a Southampton dealer who was delighted to get some Titanic relics. According to Ellen's granddaughter, Ellen was paid only £450, about $560, for all of those items, necklace included. And that's just a little more than $1,000 today. The piece was easily worth a 5-figure amount. That should tell us just how desperate she was to get her hands on some money. Ellen remained in Perthshire until her death on October 29, 2005. She was 92 years old, and in those 92 years, the question of her paternity was never definitively or publicly resolved. I'm sure that Ellen would have found bittersweetness in the revelation that DNA testing proved her right in December of the year 2020. It was then that DNA comparisons of members of the Phillips and Morley families conclusively established that Henry Morley was the father of Ellen Mary Phillips, 15 years after her death. Ellen was certainly no saint, but I do find it sad that for her own sake, she never got the proof of paternity that she had sought her whole life. This, in and of itself, is confirmation for me that though Ellen Mary was not yet born when the ship and her father slipped under the surface of the Atlantic Ocean that early morning, that she was still in every way a survivor of the Titanic disaster. As for the other people left behind in the wreckage of the Henry and Kate affair, they remained faithful to their partners. Henry's abandoned wife turned widow, Louisa, never remarried. She died on September 1st, 1930. And the daughter Henry deserted, Doris, went on to marry a man of the cloth, Reverend Arthur Sidwell Johnson. Doris was his wife until he died in 1992. She lived to be 100, dying in Warwickshire in 2000. Kate's great-granddaughter, Beverly Farmer, now owns the sealskin purse that once contained the Love of the Sea necklace and Titanic cabin keys. She has kept the story of Kate and Henry alive for the sake of her family's history. The necklace is still likely in the possession of the dealer who purchased it in the 1990s. So, what many of us may have thought was a completely fictional component of James Cameron's Titanic was based on the sad love story of Kate Phillips and Henry Morley. And the moral of their story is mainly for the fellas, and it is, don't abandon your wife and sneak out of your country with a young harlot. If you do, you'll die.
Hi everybody. I know that a lot of you are probably seeing my face for the very first time. Maybe you have heard my voice often. If you are new to the channel, then you're seeing my face and my voice for the first time. So thank you for coming. If you have been listening to me, thank you so much for helping me get to 135,000 subscribers without ever having even seen my face. I do want you to know that I'm a real person and I dress like this every day because I love history. But this isn't about me. Today we're here to talk about Arabella Huntington, the real-life inspiration for the character Mrs. Sylvia Chamberlain on HBO's The Gilded Age. HBO's The Gilded Age is another television show that is brilliantly written by Julian Fellowes, the creator of Downton Abbey. And there is no better place to talk about that show than this channel, Ty's Hot Mess History. I can't think of a better place. Whether or not you watch the show, if you like historical scandals, stay tuned for this episode. I'm covering all of the real-life people, places, and events that were depicted in the Gilded Age. But we have to keep in mind that it's a fictional show that's based in reality. The Gilded Age was a real time in history. The Russells and the Van Bryns and the Scotts are fictional families, but they interact with some of the wealthiest and most noteworthy people who did live during the Gilded Age. People like the Vanderbilts, Jay Gould, J.P. Morgan, and T. Thomas Fortune. They also interact with characters who were based on people who existed at that time. One of those characters is Mrs. Chamberlain. On the show, she is portrayed as a woman whose reputation is so bad that proper ladies should not even be seen in the same room as she. They should not speak to her. They should not even look in her direction. For if they do, their own reputations will be in jeopardy. Now that sounds extreme, but that was life in the 1880s. And why was she such a scandal? Because before her husband married her, while he was still married to his first wife, she was his mistress. And to make matters worse, she had a son with her husband. And doing the math, that son was conceived before they were married and while he was still married to his first wife, while his first wife was sick and dying. That's the story of Mrs. Chamberlain. She's based on the real-life Arabella Huntington. All of those things were true about her in real life. On the television show, she is also portrayed to be a very rich woman. This was also true about her in real life. Now, I don't know how many seasons there are going to be of The Gilded Age, but I do hope that they go into her story deeply enough and long enough to get to her second husband. They may or may not, but we will get to it today in this episode of Ty's Hot Mess History. Let's get into it. Arabella Huntington is the real-life inspiration for the Gilded Age character Mrs. Chamberlain, who is played by Jean Triplehorn. From this point on in her story, I will stop referencing the HBO TV show. If you watch the show, then you know which character I'm talking about. If you don't watch the show, that's just fine. The real-life story of Arabella Huntington is better than fiction, and you don't need to follow that TV show to follow this video. Arabella Huntington was one of the richest women in the country in her adult life, but she grew up poor and without a father. She made a name and a fortune for herself at a time when only men were able to make such moves. She married a man who knew how to make money, and she knew how to spend it. And I don't mean that she knew how to spend money in the typical sense, like when you think of a housewife who's married to a really wealthy man and she just spends his cash as quickly as he can earn it. No. What I mean is that she had a really good sense for business. She purchased items that appreciated in value, like real estate and art. She had one of the finest art collections in the country. She had every reason to be proud of herself, but she lived a great deal of her life in shame, and that had a lot to do with her son. She loved him, but times were different then. It was the late 1800s, and he was born out of wedlock. Her bundle of joy, her bouncing baby boy, was born a secret that she needed to keep. And from the moment that he was conceived, Era spent the rest of her life lying about the timeline of his existence in an effort to legitimize his birth to her high society circles that never really accepted her as one of them. But we'll get back to her son's birth. Here's what we know about her birth. Arabella was born around the year 1850. Remember, this is a time when birth records weren't exactly a top priority, and it was even less of a priority if you were a girl. Her parents were Richard and Catherine Yarrington. Arabella was born in Alabama, and that's where she lived with her family until her father died when she was about 9 years old. This left her mother, Catherine, in a tough position. You see, Arabella was just one of 5 children, so Catherine had to make some money to feed all of her babies, and she came up with a plan that worked. She opened a boarding house in Richmond, Virginia. Fast forward about 10 years. The man who would be Arabella's first husband crosses paths with her at her mother's boarding house. His name was Collis Huntington. He was part of what was called California's Big Four. That referred to the Big Four railroad company barons. Not only was Collis Huntington a part of the Big Four, he was the dominant member and the founder of Southern Pacific Railroad. Well, in 1869, he went to Washington, D.C. to lobby for federal money for a rail line going south from San Francisco. Now, this is the age of the robber baron. Here's how Oxford Languages defines robber baron: a person who has become rich through ruthless and unscrupulous business practices. Originally with references to prominent U.S. businessmen in the late 19th century. And Collis Huntington certainly fit this bill. And this is likely why he was the dominant member of the Big Four. On his lobbying trip in D.C., he fooled the members of Congress to get the money that he wanted. So he was asking for money to lay miles and miles of railroad track. And of course, it costs less to lay track over flat land than it does land that's going through mountain ranges. But Collis wanted to squeeze as much money as he could out of the government, so he presented fake maps of California, showing them mountain ranges that did not exist. Why? Because it cost twice as much to lay tracks in the mountains. Now we're talking the late 1800s here, a time when it wasn't really a common thing to take business trips to go and survey land, especially almost clear across the country. Anyway, his request got approved. He got all of the money that he wanted, which was a lot more than he needed for his project. And where did that extra money go? Right into his fat pockets. And after all that lying to get his hands on some dough, a fellow's got to rest. And Collis Huntington rested at Catherine Yarrington's boarding house, Arabella's mom's place. And that is where he met his future wife, Arabella Yarrington, who would become Arabella Huntington if Collis got his way. And he usually did get his way. This was another one of those times that he got his way, eventually. But there were 2 obstacles in the way: John Worsham and Elizabeth Stoddard. John Worsham was the man who Arabella was dating. He ran a gambling parlor that Collis likely visited on his stay in the Washington, D.C. area. Now, some rumors went as far as saying that Arabella was married to John Worsham. That may or may not be true. But one thing that is true is that at that time that she was his girl, he was also a married man. Which brings us to the other obstacle to the Collis Huntington Arabella union, Elizabeth Stoddard. She was Collis Huntington's wife. But let's be real, Arabella obviously was no stranger to being with married men, and good old Collis didn't seem to be too concerned about his own wife. Roughly 9 months after Arabella met Collis, she had a son. There was always gossip about who the father was. Was it Worsham? The rumor was that after she got pregnant with Worsham's child, he left her, then went back to his wife. Or was Collis actually the father? It's hard to know, because she gave her son Worsham's last name. But is that something that she did just to keep scandal away from Collis Huntington's name? I truly don't know, because this woman lived her life telling one lie to cover up the next one for years. But what is known for certain is that after she became pregnant, regardless of who the child's father was, Collis Huntington took her to Texas, where she stayed for most of her pregnancy. She gave birth to her son in Texas. His name was Archer Milton Worsham, and after he was born, Collis paid for mother and son to move to New York City to live in a beautiful home that just happened to be very close to his own Park Avenue home, the home that he shared with the obstacle, Elizabeth Stoddard. She was Collis Huntington's wife, who was dying of cancer, while he was trying to figure out how to be closer to his new 19-year-old lover. And I guess that I can just throw this in before we get in much more deeply. So we have the theories about which man actually fathered her son. Well, her son, when he became an adult, threw his own theory into the pile. He preferred the thought that the wealthy railroad tycoon was his father, even though he had the last name of the other man. He contended that Collis took Arabella to New York to care for his invalid wife, and then, after that, the two fell in love, and later conceived a child, who was himself. It still doesn't make his parents seem like great people, but at least that way, it's the rich man's blood that is flowing through his veins in his version of the story. When Arabella arrived in New York City, she added another lie to her resume. She fashioned herself as the young widow of Worsham. And it's not like she was well enough known for anyone to be able to fact check her story, so it worked for a while. And I won't say that she taught Collis Huntington how to lie. He clearly knew how to tell lies, really good ones, as we can recall from his stunt to get more money out of the United States Congress. But he did join in on Arabella's lies about who she was and how she knew him. 7 years after he moved Arabella to Manhattan to live under his wife's nose, he took Arabella to Texas on a couples trip. But he told everybody that she was his niece. And their age difference certainly made that seem like a believable lie. After all, he was 30 years older than Arabella. But depending on what you value in life, you may say that her lies were worth it. I mean, she was a girl who grew up really poor, but as an adult, she was someone who would never know poverty again, because all of the lies that she told put herself in a position to get a very wealthy man to spend a lot of money on her. And he spent a lot of money on her, and he gave her a lot of money to spend, and she seemed to spend it really wisely. It's funny. He used to actually brag about how he never spent more than $200 on anything that he would wear. But when it came to Arabella, the sky was the limit. He showered her with everything that he could, and he loved to give her expensive jewels. But remember, she didn't just take money and just take things from him. She learned how to make money, and she was good at it. She took it upon herself to learn about real estate. She learned how to buy and sell high-end properties. As a matter of fact, J.D. Rockefeller bought one of the homes that she renovated to sell. She also learned about buying and selling stocks, and she made a fortune off of that too. Perhaps she thought that Collis would get tired of her one day and trade her in for an even younger mistress, so she'd better get all that she could while the getting was good. But he was in it for the long haul. That is, after his wife died. And his wife, Elizabeth Stoddard, died in 1884, allowing Arabella to step up from the role of the side chick to official wife. They say you can't turn a hoe into a housewife. Well, Collis Huntington begs to differ. As if this couple's story wasn't scandalous enough by itself with just the two of them, the reverend who officiated their wedding ceremony led a life that was so scandalous that perhaps he was the only one fit to bless this mess. He was Reverend Henry Ward Beecher. He was the brother of Harriet Beecher Stowe, the author of the American classic Uncle Tom's Cabin. Now, Reverend Beecher had only one wife, but he had a long string of mistresses, and they were bold. They would come to watch him preach in church every Sunday. A new mistress, sitting there next to the church's first lady, his wife. After the wedding, the couple moved into his Fifth Avenue home. They had the money and the mansion, but their scandalous reputations made it impossible to join the ranks of high society. The Astors were the gatekeepers, and they would not let them pass through. They couldn't get into the ballrooms of the Astors or the Vanderbilts, who were fairly new to high society themselves. Though they couldn't get into the ballrooms of the Astors or the Vanderbilts, that didn't stop the Huntingtons from enjoying their life and their money, and they had lots of it. Arabella got Collis into purchasing art, and she built one of the most impressive collections in the world. In the year 1900, Collis died while he was on vacation. He was 78 years old, and he left most of his fortune, 2/3 of it, to his wife, Arabella, about $150 million. Adjusted for inflation, that's like having $5 billion today in 2023. His death left her one of the richest women on the planet. Well, she only got 2/3 of his fortune. What about the other third? That went to Collis's favorite nephew, Henry Huntington. And guess what else he got that belonged to his deceased uncle? His wife. Yes, Arabella married Henry Huntington, her husband's nephew, which means that she married her own nephew. It was by marriage, but still, that was her nephew. If he was her husband's nephew, he was her nephew too. Handling all the arrangements for Collis's estate brought them closer together at a time when it just so happened that Henry found himself being more distant from his own wife. You heard that correctly. Arabella had once again moved in on another lady's husband. But hey, the blame isn't all on her. It takes two to tango, and he was the one who had made the commitment to his wife. Anyway, Arabella and Henry Huntington got married right after he divorced his wife. I guess just to give her a point, I should mention that even though she was his aunt, there was no big age gap. Remember, she was much younger than her first husband, and the nephew and she were roughly the same age, either born the same year or just 1 year apart. And he had a palace built for her in California that was bigger and more luxurious than anything that she had ever known in Manhattan. And Arabella Huntington lived a bi-coastal life until she passed away in 1924, making herself a scandal from sea to shining sea.
Even if you didn't watch this, you probably know that it happened.
The outcome of this election is not what we wanted, not what we fought for, not what we voted for, but hear me when I say, the light of America's promise will always burn bright.
And for some, Kamala's concession speech might have felt a little like deja vu, because a few years earlier, this happened.
This is not the outcome we wanted or we worked so hard for, and I'm sorry that we did not win this election for the values we share and the vision we hold for our country. But I feel pride and gratitude for this wonderful campaign that we built together. I know how disappointed you feel because I feel it too.
Whoa, 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 Hills. Speak for yourself. We here at Ty's Hot Mess History are not disappointed because we have a good old story to get to today. Kamala Harris and Hillary Clinton are only two of the most recent women who have run for the office of President of the United States and lost. There were a number of women who came before them. Before Hillary, there was Carol Moseley Braun in 2004. Before her, there was Elizabeth Dole, wife of Senate Majority Leader Bob Dole. She ran in 2000. Before her, there was Lenora Falani, the first Black woman to be on the ballot in all 50 states, heading the New Alliance Party ticket in 1988. Before her, there was Sonia Johnson, who ran as a candidate of the U.S. Citizens Party in 1984. Before her, Linda Jennis ran as the candidate for the Social Workers Party in 1972. That was the same year as Shirley Chisholm's historic campaign as the first Black woman to run for president. But I want to make something very clear about that, because most people often get it wrong and say that she was on the ballot. She wasn't. She lost in the Democratic primary race, so her name was not on the ballot in the general election that year. George McGovern outpaced Shirley Chisholm and his other opponents by a substantial margin, and it was his name that was on the ballot. He lost to President Richard Nixon. Before Shirley Chisholm, there was Margaret Chase Smith, who ran in the Republican primary. She came in dead last, losing to Barry Goldwater, and he lost to President Lyndon Baines Johnson. Then, 80 years before Margaret Smith, there was Belva Ann Lockwood, who ran for president on the ticket of the Equal Rights Party in 1884 and 1888. But even before her, there was the topic of our story today, Victoria California Claflin Woodhull, the first woman to ever run for president of the United States. And she did it in 1872. Her story has it all. Shady, no-good parents, an absolutely horrid first husband who met her when she was 14 and he was twice her age. We're going to take a very deep dive into that marriage. A sister who was her partner in crime, and then later her business partner. She also got into an entanglement with Cornelius Vanderbilt, one of the richest men in the world at the time. And of course, Victoria's historic presidential campaign, which involved a bit of a scandal with Frederick Douglass. We're also going to take a dive into her scandal involving Henry Ward Beecher. He is the brother of Harriet Beecher Stowe. She is the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin. See, Henry Ward Beecher was a minister, and he loved his flock, especially the women in it. He loved some of them in ways that were highly inappropriate, and Victoria may or may not have exposed him in the newspaper that she and her sister owned. It's a lot. A historic run for president and a total hot mess. Let's get into it. Victoria Claflin Woodhull was called many things in her day. Audacious was one of the nicer words used to describe her. Scandalous was another one, and it was accurate. Scandal was in her bloodline. Victoria's story begins with her roots, planted firmly in scandal. Her father, the dubious Reuben Buckman Claflin, simply known as Buck, came from the Massachusetts-based Scottish-American Claflin family, a rather prominent family that boasted a governor in its family tree. But Buck was from the compromised branch of the Claflin family tree. He was an attorney, a snake oil salesman, and an all-around con artist. Buck married the equally questionable Roxana Hummel. Roxana was born to unwed parents, which was completely taboo in the early 1800s, and Roxana was also illiterate. Together, she and Buck produced a litter of troublemakers, 10 children total. Only 6 reached adulthood, and of those 6, each one was seemingly more problematic than the last. Yet, from this dubious brood, 2 rose to prominence as social marvels of their age, Victoria and her younger sister, Tennessee. Victoria was born into poverty in Homer, Ohio, a rural frontier town. Her birth date was September 23, 1838. She was child number 7 out of the 10. Days were generally gloomy for Victoria and her siblings. Their father could rarely scrape together enough money to pay bills and put food on the table. Victoria lived a life of what felt like a never-ending cycle of little comfort and lots of abuse, specifically starvation, whippings, and lack of education. Her parents only allowed her to attend school for 3 years off and on, even though teachers at Homer's Methodist Church thought that she was a brilliant child. Buck and Roxana thought that Victoria's time would better be spent earning money for the family. That meant joining her father in his shady snake oil business sales and any other crooked schemes to make a quick buck, telling fortunes, selling homemade medicines, and traveling medicine shows. By the time Victoria turned 11, the Woodhull family had no choice but to travel when their family got run out of town because of one of his schemes. So, Buck acquired the title to a local grist mill, a big piece of equipment that grinds grain into flour. It was already rotting and no longer useful when he bought it. Ever the con man and always looking for a way to get paid without, working, he went to his insurance company and heavily insured the useless mill. And only days later, it mysteriously burned down to the ground. Aw, shucks. Somehow, he was able to get the insurance money quickly. Now, we can all agree that what he did was deceitful, but at least his family would be better off, right? Wrong. Buck took that money and vanished. He left his family stranded, wife and children. They had to stay behind and live in shame because of his actions. It took about 2 seconds for officials to solve Buck's arson and fraud, and that was it for the Woodhull clan. Nobody wanted any of them in Homer anymore. The town was so against them that the locals held a benefit of sorts to raise the money to fund a relocation for the rest of the family. They felt like Buck had left his trash behind. The good people of Homer meant business. They were poor, but they raised so much money that they were able to give Roxana enough money to take her little spawns not only away from Homer, but away from the state of Ohio altogether. Now, it's often said that women marry some version of their father. I want you to keep this story about Buck in your memory for when we get to Victoria's first husband. And we're almost there. I know that she's only 11 at this point in the story, but we're almost there. When Buck ran out of bucks after abandoning his family, he was all too happy to reunite with them because he wanted to be a stand-up guy and do the right thing this time. Just kidding. He wanted to put them back to work and make him some more money. Yeah, it was time to restart the Healing Act. It was the perfect scheme for Buck, who thought that work was a forbidden 4-letter word, because now his daughters were older. They could take on the brunt of the labor. But not only were they older, they were pretty young girls who could attract the attention of men. It was going to be so easy for Buck to make money off of Victoria in Tennessee. It was the most convenient family reunion for Buck. He and his family were on the road, traveling from town to town across Ohio with Victoria and Tennessee captivating audiences as spiritualists and hypnotists. In every town, the sisters took the stage, using their spiritual gifts to entertain, bewilder, and scandalize. In this act, they were the stars, bold, unrestrained, and unapologetically provocative, leaving each town buzzing with tales of the bewitching Claflin sisters. The Claflin family's unity was built on shaky foundations, to say the least. Now that they had money coming in from their phony medicine sales and healing, tensions among them increased because they didn't trust each other. One family member was always eyeing the other, trying to be sure that the money was evenly split. None of them were ever satisfied. The constant quarrels and schemes of Buck and Roxana eventually led Victoria to make a bold move. A smart move. She persuaded her younger sister, Tennessee, to break away from the family's scheme and form their own duo of deception. This way, they didn't have to fight over money anymore. They left that to their parents and their other siblings. Even from a very young age, Victoria was no fool. She understood why Tennessee would be the perfect business partner for her. Tennessee was beautiful and charming. With her sister at her side, getting men to fork over their money would be easy. But while Tennessee wielded her physical charm, Victoria possessed something even more formidable. Though both equally stunning, Victoria had an added edge. She was a fast thinker with a shrewd mind. She was quick-witted and resourceful,
traits that made her an exceptional manipulator. She would need those traits later in life, and she would surely use them. The sister act with Victoria and Tennessee was profitable for a while. The girls were still helping to support their family, but they were able to keep a little more money for themselves after going their own way with their own healing shows. But all of that came to an end when Victoria fell sick. Starting the time she hit puberty, she constantly suffered from chills and fever and later rheumatism, a condition marked by inflammation and pain in the joints and muscles. At least that's what it was called back then. There's no way to be sure 100% of what the name of her condition was. Why do I say this? Because the doctor who treated her was only a doctor because he called himself one. His name was Canning Woodhull, and he practiced medicine in Ohio at the time, a time when no formal medical education or licensing was required. You may have picked up that his last name was Woodhull, and yes, he became Victoria's first husband. He was 28 years old when he was treating, and I use that term loosely, Victoria when she was only 14 years old, and claimed that he fell in love with her while she was his patient. But I won't tell you this part of the story only from my own words. I'm going to share with you some of the direct words of Theodore Tilton. He and Victoria were associates on the same side of an argument. I'll tell you more about him later. But here's what he wrote about Victoria's first marriage, taken from an 1874 edition of the Brooklyn Eagle. I'm sure that you'll know what he wrote versus my commentary. First, he confirms that Victoria was 14 and Canning was 28 when they met, and that the useless Buck and Roxana allowed and encouraged this relationship. After undergoing treatment from the unlicensed doctor, this is what happened next, according to Theodore. Before she entirely recovered, and while looking haggard and sad, one day he stopped her in the street and said, "My little chick, I want you to go with me to the picnic," referring to a projected 4th of July excursion then at hand. Buck and Roxana gave her permission, but Buck told her that she had to buy her own shoes. So she sold apples to collect enough money, and she was able to go to the picnic with Canning. Theodore goes on to write, on coming home from the festival, the brilliant fop, who, tired of the demi-monde ladies, whom he could purchase for his pleasure, and inspired with a sudden and romantic interest in this artless maid, said to her, "My little puss, tell your father and mother that I want you for a wife." End quote. Now, Victoria was not pleased by this offer at all, but she followed the doctor's orders. She went home and told her parents what Dr. Canning said, and they were so happy at the thought of getting rid of a mouth to feed that they happily accepted Canning's proposal. The pair got married 2 months after Victoria turned 15, and things went downhill immediately. Here's what Theodore wrote about their first week of marriage. On the 3rd day after taking his child wife to his lodgings, he broke her heart by remaining away all night at a house of ill repute. Then for the first time she learned, to her dismay, that he was habitually unchaste and given to long fits of intoxication. She was stung to the quick. The shock awoke all her womanhood. She grew 10 years older in a single day. That's what he said. So this poor child did the only thing that she could think to do, and that was to fight for her marriage and to try to win her husband back. Victoria had a dreadful time with this man. Theodore continued, quote, 6 weeks after her marriage, during which time her husband was mostly with his cups and his mistresses, she discovered a letter addressed to him in a lady's elegant penmanship saying, "Did you marry that child because she, too, was en famille?" meaning pregnant in French. This was an additional thunderbolt. The fact was that her husband, on the day of his marriage, had sent away into the country a mistress who a few months later gave birth to a child. Squandering his money like a prodigal, he suddenly put his wife into the humblest quarters, where, left mostly to herself, she dwelt in bitterness of spirit, aggravated from time to time by learning of his ordering of baskets of champagne and drinking himself drunk in the company of harlots. Sometimes, with uncommon courage, through rain and sleet, half clad and shivering, she would track him to his dens,
and by the energy of her spirit compel him to return. At other times, all night long she would watch at the window, waiting for his footsteps, until she heard them languidly shuffling along the pavement, with the staggering reel of a drunken man in the shameless hours of the morning. End quote. So now she was spending months just praying to God that her husband would somehow start to love her. God was like, no. Theodore goes on. In 15 months after her marriage, while living in a little low-frame house in Chicago in the dead of the winter, with icicles clinging to her bedpost, and attended only by her half-drunken husband, she brought forth in almost mortal agony her firstborn child. End quote. My goodness. So in this season of her life, the only real help that she had was from a next-door neighbor who took pity on her little soul. This woman would bring food for Victoria and her child. She would bring blankets for the baby. It was the only support that Victoria had, because Canning Woodhull was doing nothing except occasionally coming home drunk and drained from his stints with prostitutes. Then, after a few months, Victoria got really sick again. And of course, her husband, the good doctor, was nowhere to be found. Roxana just happened to stop by for a visit and found Victoria in such a bad state that it looked like she was about to die. For once, Roxana acted like a mother and took Victoria home and nursed her until she was well. So Victoria left her parents' house to go back to her marital home, as the standards of the time dictated that she should. And when she got there, her husband was there. Not exactly waiting on her return, more like surprised by her return. You see, he was there with one of his prostitutes who had spent the night. From the Brooklyn Eagle, quote, she returned to her own to be horror-struck at discovering that her bed had been occupied the night before by her husband in company of a wanton of the streets, and that the room was littered with remains of their drunken feast. There's more, quote, once, after a month's desertion by him, until she had no money and little to eat, she learned that he was keeping a mistress at a fashionable boarding house under the title of wife. Yeah, so this is me talking. He went right back to cheating, and while she was starving, he had his mistress living the high life. So Victoria pulled herself together in the freezing cold, wearing her nightgown and no proper shoes, and she went to confront Dr. Canning. As Theodore told it, she, quote, entered the house, confronted the household as they sat at table, told her story to the confusion of the paramour and his mistress, and drew tears from all the company, till by a common movement the listeners compelled the harlot to pack her trunk and flee the city, and shamed the husband into creeping like a spaniel back into the kennel, which his wife still cherished as her home. End quote. Now, Victoria had her husband back. Congratulations, I guess. At this point in their marriage, their baby is approaching 2 years of age. Victoria had spent 95% of their union focusing on trying to keep her husband away from alcohol and harlots. Now she could breathe and pay attention to the whole family. And what she realized about her son was just so sad. He had some type of serious developmental issues. There was some type of mental disability, perhaps severe autism or Down syndrome. Of course, the language used then was much more crude. He was called, and I quote, a half-idiot, predestined to be a hopeless imbecile for life, end quote. And it was Victoria's job, even though she was only a child herself, to look after her son and her husband. She thought, as any foolish young girl might think, that a change of scenery would change her husband. So she made the very bold decision to move her tiny family all the way across the country to California. Her hope was that getting Canning away from booze and whores would make him a faithful husband and a loving father. Unfortunately for Victoria, San Francisco also had liquor and prostitutes, and Canning's change of location didn't change his out-of-control desire for liquor and ladies of the night. At 16 years old, in a new city with no support system, it was Victoria who set out to find a job. not Dr. Canning. She answered a want ad for a cigar girl at a bar. She got the job. She didn't last a day, but not because she couldn't do the work. The owner knew that his customers would often speak inappropriately to the women who worked at the bar, and he noticed that Victoria's face would turn blush red when men made nasty remarks to her. So the owner dismissed her. He took her home to her husband and paid her $20. Honestly, that was the first time that I learned of any man being kind to Victoria in all of my research of this story. Even her own father just used her and didn't support her. Anyway, Victoria kept looking for work and was able to secure a job as a seamstress for a well-known actress named Anna Cogswell. One day while stitching up something for Anna, Victoria mentioned that she would need to find another job because the seamstress work didn't cover her bills. And of course, Dr. Canning wasn't contributing a dime to monthly household expenses. So, the actress suggested to Victoria that she might take to the stage too, and she did. Victoria auditioned for a supporting role and got the part in a play called New York by Gaslight. Her character was called Country Cousin. It doesn't sound too glamorous, but it was the 1860s and she was now earning $52 a week. That's equivalent to earning over $1,900 a week today in 2024. Victoria's money problems were finally over. Then, after only months of being on the stage and all of her fellow actors telling her to make acting her career, Victoria left it all behind after she had a vision of her closest sister, Tennessee, telling her to come home. She didn't waste any time. That same day, she gathered up her family and took a train home to Ohio. Reportedly, Tennessee was wearing the same dress in real life as she was wearing in Victoria's vision when she saw her in person after getting off of the train. And from this, another career opportunity popped into Victoria's head. She was meant to be a clairvoyant, a fortune teller. She didn't waste any time at it. She set up shop in Indiana and people started seeing her and believing in whatever she was saying. She then expanded her business into healing. Maybe she possessed miraculous powers because people believed that she was causing the lame to walk and the deaf to hear. She was making so much money. She started traveling city to city and she was in demand. One rich client tipped her $5,000. Now, Victoria was financially providing for all of her relatives. According to the Brooklyn Eagle, she earned more than $500,000 in 1869. She had more than enough money, but her heart was still heavy every time she looked at her son. She blamed his disability on herself. She couldn't seem to heal him, so she did the next best thing, in her mind, which was to pray to God for another child, a healthy girl. And it had to be a miracle from God to get her husband away from the prostitutes he loved and sleep with her for a night. Dr. Canning got Victoria pregnant with the child that she prayed for, but while she was carrying the child, in one of his drunken fits, he kicked her in the stomach. Not only did Canning physically abuse Victoria, we know that he cheated on her almost every day of their marriage, and he spent all of the money he made, when he was working, on prostitutes and alcohol. Now that she was making the money, he was spending the allowance he was given on other women and booze. But to top it all off, he would verbally abuse Victoria. He would mock her for being faithful to him and call her a fool for doing so. It wasn't until she was going into labor with her second child, with no one in the house to help her except for her drunken louse of a husband, that she finally asked herself, why should I any longer live with this man? As soon as she was able to get on her feet, she went to Chicago and filed for a divorce. And she got it. Now, this was a big win for Victoria. Divorces were not granted to women in those times just because they wanted them. The status quo was that as long as your husband wanted to keep you around, you belonged to him. Well, this newfound liberty stirred up something in Victoria's soul that she turned into a movement. Victoria's hope was that any woman who found herself in a marriage like hers could have the right to leave it through a lawful divorce. and not have to become a social pariah because of it. This was the main pillar of what was called the free love movement. Now, free love in the 1860s had nothing to do with the free love social movement of the 1960s, which promoted a sexually active lifestyle with multiple casual partners. No, for women, Victoria's free love movement sought to erase the stigma of divorce for women and make it easier for them to leave abusive marriages. And immediately after her divorce from Canning Woodhull, this free love group of women are the people Victoria starts associating with. And it is this affiliation that sets the stage for her political career. Victoria relocated to New York and entered into a new partnership, both personal and professional, with Colonel James Blood, a Civil War veteran who had commanded the 6th Missouri Volunteers. Originally from St. Louis, Blood was drawn to Victoria's fiery personality. He shared her defiance of societal norms. They were a good match. They got married. Victoria was joined in New York by her sister, Tennessee, and they continued working as healers and fortune tellers. Speaking of fortune, their work eventually brought them into the orbit of a man who had a massive one, Cornelius Vanderbilt, the powerful railroad magnate. I have to state for the record how beautiful Victoria and Tennessee were. At least, that's what was reported about them, and there are a lot of stories that back up this claim, where man after man just seems mesmerized by them and ends up doing whatever the sisters told them to do, or maybe just asked them to do, using their feminine charms. And Vanderbilt was unusually rich, but he too was just a man, and fell for their charisma exactly like other men before him had done. But Cornelius Vanderbilt had more to offer than the average man who paid Victoria and Tennessee to have his fortune read. Now, this next thing that I'm going to tell you is a rumor, but it's written in so much of the research about Victoria that I don't mind sharing it. The rumor is that the Claflin sisters gave Vanderbilt some stock tips that paid off big time. But the next part of their story is a fact. In February of 1870, Vanderbilt helped the sisters to launch Woodhull, Claflin and Company, becoming the first women to establish a brokerage firm on Wall Street. And in a very short time, Victoria and Tennessee found themselves $700,000 richer. That's $16 million today. So it does make sense that if the rumors were true, that Cornelius would have helped the women to start their own business as a repayment or returning the favor. The press articles about them refer to them as the bewitching brokers and the queens of finance. And this was great, but Victoria wanted more. The brokerage firm was not the goal, but a means to a greater goal. She envisioned a platform to champion causes close to her heart, including women's rights, labor reform, and the plight of the poor. With the Commodore Vanderbilt as the most prominent connection on their friends list, the Claflin sisters quickly became infamous in New York society. He was 74 at the time, and it was clear that stock tips weren't the only thing that he wanted to share with Tenny. That's a nickname for Tennessee. He openly entertained both sisters, but sometimes only Tennessee. Now, I've already told you that the Claflin sisters were beauties, but Tennessee, there was just something about her. She possessed a rare ability to seduce even the most discerning men, drawing them in with an almost magnetic allure. Her admirers were often men of notable intelligence who found themselves hopelessly captivated by her presence. Yet her charm wasn't limited to her looks alone. Tennessee's allure was enhanced by a cleverness that allowed her to handle these men as playthings, bending them to her will until they became utterly enthralled and often financially entangled by her. Vanderbilt was one of these men. He wasn't so foolish as to get caught up in any major scandals with her. After all, at the time that he met Tennessee, he was a newlywed. He'd just married his second wife, who was also his second cousin, whose name, oddly, was Frank Armstrong Crawford. She was 45 years younger than Cornelius. He didn't want to mess up his new marriage, but it's clear that he had a thing for Tennessee, and she could get whatever she wanted to get from the old man. Nonetheless, their association proved mutually beneficial. With Vanderbilt's advice, the sisters shook the male-dominated financial sector silently, like a hurricane. Their brokerage's success was a testament to their resourcefulness and ambition, and it cemented their place in the history of Wall Street. They were officially important now. For Victoria, this success was cute, but it was only fuel for her larger ambitions. She used her newfound prominence to advocate fiercely for social change, in a time when feminists were often derided as unfeminine or radical. Victoria's elegant demeanor defied expectations. She would make speeches and write news columns to persuade people to join her causes, and it worked. Not all the time, but often. Her beauty and refinement made men take her seriously. To them, she wasn't some ugly masculine broad who wanted parity with men. She was a dainty little broad who needed men to be nicer to all the broads. All the women. Yes, the typical image of a feminist back then was anything but feminine. Women fighting for their rights were often seen as harsh or mannish or called butch. But Victoria shattered this stereotype. She was an exquisite figure with an exquisite figure, feminine to her core, and when she stood on stage to advocate for equality, the juxtaposition of her femininity with her radical ideas was electrifying. Audiences were shook, titillated, and thoroughly captivated by this scandalous lady banker, who seemed to be fighting for everyone's rights. With money from the brokerage firm still rolling in, and people now listening to what she had to say, that still wasn't enough for Victoria. At those points in her life when she gained a lot of money and anyone else would have taken a break, that's when Victoria would dig her heels in and go for the next goal. Now she was in a position to retire and live extravagantly. Instead, she started a newspaper. Using funds from Woodhull, Claflin and Company, Victoria and Tenney launched Woodhull and Claflin's Weekly, a publication that quickly became one of the most provocative ventures in American journalism. The paper's primary mission? To bolster yet another one of Victoria's goals, her campaign for the presidency of the United States, a shocking bid that challenged every conventional notion about women's roles in society. But Woodhull and Claflin's Weekly didn't stop at promoting her political ambitions. It fiercely championed every cause that society's gatekeepers found abhorrent. Pesky little things like equality for women and justice for the poor and working class. The paper's content was radical, bordering on revolutionary. Feminism dominated its pages with articles that struck at the heart of entrenched social injustices. Woodhull and Claflin's Weekly boldly addressed topics that other publications wouldn't touch, like racial inequalities, labor unions, and workers' rights. Before the sisters realized it, they had collected an impressive roster of enemies, from corrupt politicians to self-righteous moralists who thought that women's rights were anti-Christian and immoral. But the paper also ran ads for outrageous quacks and con artists, and it's only understandable that stuff like that made it hard for people to take the newspaper seriously. And, in addition to offering publicity to whack jobs, rumor had it that Tennessee, with her irresistible charm, used the columns of the papers to discreetly blackmail some of her powerful male admirers. If they didn't want her to tell the whole story about whatever they had done, including their names, they would silently comply with whatever she wanted. She played dirty. Meanwhile, Victoria's magnetic allure continued to captivate influential men. Among her admirers was Theodore Tilton, the editor of The Independent, a semi-religious journal with considerable influence. By Victoria's own admission, her affair with Tilton was torrid, lasting a scandalous 6 months. This relationship would eventually explode into one of the greatest crises of her career. By the way, he was the one who wrote that detailed account of her first marriage. Let me tell you how we got here. So now we're at the height of Victoria's fame.
It's 1871, and she's mounted a presidential campaign against the incumbent Ulysses S. Grant and the liberal Republican candidate Horace Greeley. Victoria was nominated by the Equal Rights Party. The homely gals weren't jealous of Victoria's good looks and eloquence. They were just happy that their voices were being heard and their issues were being taken seriously by a few people. But a couple of those people were the most prominent women of her time. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, pioneers of the suffrage movement, were captivated by her audacity and determination. So I want to be clear that Victoria's nomination was historic, but in the grand scheme of things, it wasn't viewed as legitimate by most people who even slightly cared about politics. For one, Victoria was only 33 years old, meaning she had not yet reached the constitutionally mandated age of 35 to serve as president. Secondly, Victoria selected Frederick Douglass, the famous black abolitionist, as her running mate. That by itself isn't laughable. He had no clue that he was running on this ticket because she never asked him or told him, and he never accepted the nomination, nor did he acknowledge her campaign. Well, the whole thing just seemed downright ludicrous. His nomination stirred up controversy for sure, and even though Douglass agreed with some of Victoria's opinions, he was too smart to be pulled in and used by her. At the mention of his name, the fear of mixing white and black people immediately jumped into the forefronts of people's brains. Victoria's party was hoping to use the nomination of Douglass to reunite the suffragists with black American civil rights activists. They had been on the same side of issues for a long time, but the 15th Amendment 2 years earlier excluded women suffragists, which understandably caused a rift. Well, Douglass decided for himself that he was not going to be the glue that bonded these two groups together again. This vice presidential nomination from Victoria didn't excite him one bit. He did not attend the Equal Rights Convention. He did not talk about Victoria's nomination. He didn't even put up a vote for Victoria sign in his front yard. This refusal from Douglass was a big slap in the face to Victoria, who thought that a black man should be honored to have his name on the same ticket next to a white woman for the second highest office in the land. Victoria underestimated Douglass's self-worth and intellect. Victoria thought that Douglass needed her, but the truth was that she needed him, and by the time of her presidential campaign, he had garnered more political clout in the past 10 years than she would in her entire life. Douglass had been an advisor to Presidents Abraham Lincoln and Andrew Johnson. And quick spoiler alert, though I'm sure you already know, Victoria loses this election and Grant wins. Well, Douglass and Grant had been political allies since the 1860s. Douglass campaigned for Grant in the 1868 election. They were so close, in fact, that Frederick Douglass and his family lived in Grant's home from the 1870s until the early 1900s. There were so many reasons why it was just plain stupid for Victoria to choose Frederick Douglass as her running mate. At the end of the day, Douglass was a conservative and Victoria was not. They shared similar beliefs on a couple of major issues, and perhaps Douglass could have been swayed to join her side, but there is one part of Victoria's story that I rarely see mentioned in writings that might have made it absolutely impossible for Frederick Douglass to consider supporting her. It was her belief in and promotion of eugenics, selective breeding. The desired outcome of eugenics is the existence of a population with desirable characteristics. It disfavors groups thought to be inferior. And when people talk about eugenics, they tend to focus on race and, to a lesser extent, beauty. But it's not all about outward appearance. It encompasses intelligence, birth defects, and mental disabilities. When we pedestalize Victoria Woodhull for being the first female candidate for president, it might make us all a little more comfortable to think that she promoted eugenics as a measure to avoid birthing children with mental disabilities, especially when we think of the poor, innocent teenager who gave birth to her first son, Byron, who had some type of disability, and we know that this troubled her. But Victoria promoted eugenics for another reason. It was closely tied to her feminist agenda, but deeply rooted in white supremacist ideology. She reframed abolitionist arguments about slavery to center on the sexual slavery of marriage, advocating for women's sexual and reproductive independence as essential for racial improvement. Her views aligned eugenics with feminist goals, emphasizing the importance of white women's autonomy in selecting partners to ensure the advancement of the white race. And for Victoria, you had to be the right kind of white to deserve her advocacy. French, Italians, Spaniards, Russians need not apply. She wasn't too fond of poor white women either. She and a certain Austrian-born German politician of the 1930s and 40s had some similarities in their thought patterns. Her rhetoric intertwined ideas of sexual liberation, racial dominance, and societal reform. Her argument for women's sovereignty over their bodies served as a cornerstone for her broader feminist platform, but was also a vehicle for her belief in white supremacy. By linking women's independence to the preservation of Western civilization, Victoria contributed to an early racially charged discourse within feminism. This perspective of her is largely ignored in historical studies. That's exactly why I have to talk about it. It's a hot mess. Every time her name is brought up whenever a woman runs for president and loses, we always get the yay girl power story, but the yay white power story exists too. And I really appreciate Dr. Stephanie Athey exploring this topic more deeply in a brilliant writing on eugenic feminisms for University of Colorado at Boulder. I reached out to Dr. Athey in hopes of getting a better understanding of this part of Victoria Woodhull's life. Not only did she reply, but while she was out on holiday, she recorded this video for us that puts it all in very frank terms.
We have to be careful to see Woodhull as a champion of women's sexual and political empowerment in a very narrow and very ugly sense. Hers was a project that applied to white women, some white women, not all of them. It was meant to free those among them who were mentally fit, physically able-bodied, and ethnically white, as ethnically white as possible in a changing demographic influx of immigrants into the late 19th century U.S. To be clear, she argued that women's independence, including their ability to control their, quote, own sex organs and parts, unquote, including their fullest control and pleasure in sex, and their liberation from marriage and monogamy, only these things were the very keys to a stronger white race, and therefore to white supremacy, and therefore to the backbone of health, wealth, and prosperity for the nation. And eventually, as the century wore on, she would argue this freedom in sexual relations for these implicitly white upper-class women would mean the cornerstone of U.S. imperial dominance. She delivered this message on the lecture circuit to crowds in the U.S. and in England, and in her own essays and weekly publications. Quote, "To woman by nature belongs the right of sexual self-determination. When the instinct is aroused in her, then only should sex follow. When woman rises from sexual slavery into freedom, into the ownership and control of her sexual organs, and man is obliged to respect that control and freedom, then will the intensity and glory of her creative functions be increased 100-fold. As to the difficulty of freedom for women," she writes, "there is but one, and that is pecuniary independence." Her message is simple and radical. Only through the very best sex, as women define that sex for themselves, do women make their best babies.
Back to Frederick Douglass. Not only did he not support Victoria, he actively supported Grant. Frederick Douglass was a loyal Republican who supported Grant's run for a second term. Grant had supported a number of civil rights acts in 1870 and 1871. He spoke against the Ku Klux Klan, and he supported sending the Union Army to the South to protect the lives of Black people who wanted to vote. For Frederick Douglass, the choice was clear. I can only imagine Douglass buying a newspaper and reading this headline that he's running for VP with Victoria and saying, say what now? Well, if the Frederick Douglass running mate debacle wasn't enough of a controversy for Victoria's campaign, she had another trick up her lacy sleeve. This one would be the final nail in the coffin of this insane campaign. So, you've probably heard of a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin. Significant work of American literature, best-selling novel, second best-selling book of the 19th century following only the Bible. It was written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, a name that many still know today. Well, Harriet's family were famous abolitionists during the period of our story. Henry Ward Beecher isn't a name that people throw around today, but in the 1870s, he may have been more popular than Harriet Beecher Stowe. He was her brother and a renowned preacher. He was the celebrated leader of Brickland's Plymouth Church, a towering figure, charismatic, energetic, and full of life. Henry Beecher held an influence few could match. As an orator, he was unrivaled. As a theologian, he was less impressive. But where he truly excelled was in captivating an audience, winning hearts and inspiring loyalty. The way, for some reason, I see Henry Ward Beecher in a similar light, based on what I've read about him. He was known for his support of the abolition of slavery. His sermons emphasized God's love, and he loved sharing his own love, particularly with the fine sisters in his flock. And by that I mean that he was slinging his big old penis all over that congregation. Everybody knew about it, but nobody talked about it. That is, until one brave soul decided that he couldn't contain the secret anymore. But his interest in the scandal was more personal than other people's, because one of those Bible-thumping women Pastor Beecher was having his way with was this guy's wife. This guy is Theodore Tilton, a man who started out as an acquaintance of Victoria's, but they became very chummy after he told Victoria about the affair that the good Reverend was having with his wife. Why did this matter to Victoria? Well, Pastor Beecher agreed with Victoria's positions on abolition and even women's suffrage to a point. But Victoria had some beliefs that he thought were just a little too far to the left for him. For one, she was a spiritualist who believed in multiple spirits that were guiding humans and not God with a capital G. And Beecher disagreed with and preached against Victoria's free love stance. Before, Victoria just saw these issues as differences of opinions between her and the pastor. Now that she knew that he was getting it on with women in his congregation, she saw his public stance on the free love movement as hypocrisy. Now she'd have to expose him. First, she'd give him a warning. She told Harriet and her sister Catherine that they needed to get their brother under control, make him stop talking about her. Well, that was a stupid move on Victoria's part, because the Beecher sisters didn't like Victoria at all. So Henry continued to get in his pulpit and tell his parishioners about Victoria, the harlot, and her Jezebel ways. Victoria had had enough, so she delivered an ultimatum to the Beecher family. Either rein in their beloved Reverend brother, Henry Ward Beecher, or she'd unleash the scandal on them. Yeah, Harriet, no one is going to want to hear another word of your brother's fire and brimstone after I print the story about his affair with Mrs. Tilton in my newspaper. This was not an idle threat. In the November 2nd, 1872 issue of Woodhull and Claflin's Weekly, Victoria laid bare the whole sordid affair between Beecher and Elizabeth Tilton. It was a scandalous expose that tore apart Beecher's carefully cultivated public image as a moral leader. In private, Beecher was a far cry from the pulpit powerhouse. Behind closed doors, he was described as weak and even pitiful, a contrast made all the more glaring against his fierce controlling sisters, Harriet and Catherine. This was not Victoria's smartest move, for she had unwisely underestimated the power of the Beecher family. She printed every detail of Pastor Beecher's affair with Elizabeth Tilton, Theodore's wife. That ended up embarrassing everyone involved. You see, the year prior, Theodore approached Pastor Henry about sleeping with his wife, and almost as if the pastor had Theodore under a spell, he got Theodore to sign a document that damn near said that not only did Theodore know that the pastor was having sex with his wife, he would never talk about it, and he practically condoned the affair. It was insane. And after Victoria published this story on November 2nd, 1872, it backfired on her big time. All that she wanted to do was to point out the double standard between men and women when it came to sex. And she did that, but it came at a price. The very same day she was arrested. The charge, publishing an obscene newspaper. Her sister and her husband were thrown in the slammer too. They were arrested compliments of Anthony Comstock, as in the Comstock Act, the act that makes it criminal for the post office to deliver obscene material. Comstock saw to it that Victoria and Tennessee were held in the Ludlow Street jail, a jail for hardened criminals. And it wasn't just some overnight stay in jail. She certainly had more than enough money to bail out, but there was no bail. Victoria had to stay behind bars for months. If you caught the date that she got arrested, then you know what that means. Arrested on November 2nd, 1872, election year? It means that Victoria wasn't even able to vote for herself, and she needed every vote she could get. Needless to say, she didn't win the 1872 presidency. But in a race where even the smallest third parties received at least one electoral college vote, Victoria received 0. But she did have one guy in Texas vote for her. As he said, he was just casting a vote against Grant. Even with the multiple candidates who had their hats in the ring, the election of 1872 was the same as every other presidential race. There were only 2 candidates who had a real chance of winning. Grant and Greeley. Grant won. Horace Greeley died right after the election. Victoria was sad, but she didn't take the news quite that badly. But she didn't have too much to smile about, because the Beecher family was not done with her yet. Victoria's determination to bring down Pastor Beecher had negative effects on all of the parties involved. Theodore Tilton sued Beecher for adultery and alienation of affection because now his own manhood was on the line. That trial ended in a hung jury. Speaking of hung, Pastor Beecher had his congregation at the Plymouth Church in Brooklyn to conduct their own investigation of him. And surprise, surprise, they found him innocent. He was allowed to continue preaching. His first order of business was to excommunicate Theodore Tilton. Can you believe it? The adulterous pastor gets to stay. The man who was cheated on has to go. And why the hell was Theodore still a member of that church anyway? You would have had to kick me out. I would have left on my own. Things got so bad for Theodore that he had to leave the country after Victoria's stunt because he could no longer find work. He had to move to Paris. The preacher came out almost unscathed. He continued preaching and sexing up the women in his congregation. He was just no longer seen as the moral authority that he had made himself out to be before Victoria's article. Victoria lived to regret printing that story because after she was released from jail, the Beecher sisters made Victoria's life a living hell. They kept her and Tennessee in court, fighting legal battles over their newspaper. It got so bad that they had to completely shut it down. Woodhull and Claflin's weekly was over. Henry's sisters hated Victoria's guts. There was Harriet Beecher Stowe, and then there was Catherine. Well, Catherine was an anti-suffragist. She didn't think that women should have been allowed to vote. So she thought that Victoria was just way too radical. She didn't like her lifestyle. She looked down on her. So with the help of her famous sister Harriet, she did everything that she could to destroy Victoria's reputation and to disrupt her comfortable life. Now, telling whomever would listen that Victoria was a nut job was one thing, but the Beecher sisters used their influence to get Victoria kicked out of every townhouse and apartment she rented. As soon as she and Tennessee got settled into a place, here came the Beecher sisters, applying pressure on the landlord to evict those heathenist sisters. And it worked, time after time after time. If any landlord tried to let the Claflin sisters live in peace, the Beecher sisters would simply tell all of their followers to go and harass that landlord. Landlords who dared show Victoria and Tenny any sympathy or respect quickly found themselves ostracized, harassed, and coerced into compliance. Victoria was vilified, hounded from every corner, and treated like a social pariah by the Beecher sisters' minions. Something had to give, and it wasn't going to be the Beechers. Their campaign to destroy Victoria was far more successful than her campaign for the presidency. By the time they were done with Victoria, she was nearly bankrupt. Remember all of that money she had? But thankfully for Victoria, her husband, James Blood, still supported her free love movement. He supported it so much that he divorced her. The Beechers had done a darn good job of destroying what was left of Victoria's image. Victoria was done, and by association, so was Tennessee. By 1877, the sisters were surrounded by adversaries, with many eagerly awaiting their downfall. They were out of options in America and in a very desperate position. But just as the odds seemed insurmountable, Commodore Vanderbilt rescued the sisters one last time because he died. Here's what I mean. His death became a lifeline for Victoria and Tennessee thanks to an unexpected twist in his will. Vanderbilt's son, William, inherited the bulk of his father's $90 million fortune. Then almost immediately, whispers circulated about a mysterious settlement involving Tennessee and Victoria. Well, those rumors must have had some truth to them, because everyone knew that the sisters had been seemingly on the brink of financial collapse. But all of a sudden, they departed for England, and they couldn't have done that without money. Gossip suggested that a sum of money had been paid to quietly remove them from the scene, quashing any potential courtroom drama that might expose more scandalous family secrets. After all, Cornelius Vanderbilt's wife was still alive. Nobody needed to know anything more about him and Tennessee than they already knew. Now, I've seen the amount of money that William gave them reported to be as little as $1,000 and as much as $500,000. Whatever it was more than the $0 that the sisters had before, and it allowed them to make their transatlantic getaway. With two powerful families on their tails, each for different reasons, the Claflin sisters couldn't have stayed at home no matter what. So they boarded a ship with nothing but the funds that had just come in, and their good looks still intact. Though it was in a lot of newspapers that Tennessee had put on some weight, 'cause, that's important journalism, to talk about a woman's weight. And guess who was in Europe at the same time as Victoria? Her best friend, former President Grant. As far as America was concerned, it was good riddance to Victoria and her conniving sister. She was another continent's problem now. As the San Francisco Examiner wrote in a brief on August 9, 1877, with Grant, the potato bug, and Victoria Woodhull, Europe will get enough of America this season. End quote. The potato bug was the Colorado potato beetle. In 1877, it reached the UK, where it was first reported in Liverpool. It was a major pest for potato crops. Now, England would have the pleasure of hosting two more pests, Victoria and Tennessee. Their hope was that having distance from their country would also help to distance them from their scandals. If they were ever going to live the good life again, they would need to find men with money to marry them. It took some years, but Victoria was able to get married again. While she was rehashing an old lecture at St. James Hall in London, she met an aristocratic banker named John Martin, who didn't know her story and was willing to take a chance with her. When his mother saw that John was taking his relationship with Victoria seriously, she protested. She forbade him from marrying Victoria, as in, over my dead body. Then she died, and John married Victoria in 1883. October 31st, 1883 to be exact, Halloween, and I'm sure that his mother would have thought that an appropriate day. 2 years later, Tennessee found her happy ending when a wealthy Portuguese viscount named Fred Cook asked her for her hand in marriage. On her wedding day, her favorite people were in attendance, but her honeymoon had an unexpected and uninvited guest, the ghost of her past life with Victoria. A huge expose was printed about Victoria in Tennessee just days after Tennessee's wedding. It was mostly about Victoria, but of course, talked about the scandalous lives of both women in America. It was a warning to Fred about the family he was marrying into, but it was too late. Might have been more impactful if the story had dropped before the wedding. I couldn't find the original article, but an 1885 edition of the Chicago Tribune published parts of it. Quote, disagreeable stories had been told about her in the contest over the will of old Commodore Vanderbilt. Her name had been mixed up with that of Theodore Tilton in the famous Beecher trial. Her free love principles were well known. The gentleman who married Mrs. Woodhull was regarded as one of the most eligible matches in England. He is young, very rich, a member of a good family, and finely educated. When young Martin made up his mind to marry Mrs. Woodhull, there was a social storm in London. The young man's mother said emphatically that he would never be allowed to marry the woman as long as she lived. So Mr. Martin, like a dutiful son, said nothing more of the engagement until his mother's death, after which he made Mrs. Woodhull his wife. End quote. Now again, this story didn't stop Tenny's marriage, nor did it make her husband or Victoria's husband divorce either one of the women, but it did kill their father. That's according to Victoria. Buck died shortly after the expose was printed, and this is what Victoria had to say about it from a brief in an 1885 edition of the San Francisco Examiner. Quote, Mrs. Woodhull's father. She claims he died of grief. The Sun prints the following special cable dated yesterday. Sir, my father, Reuben B. Claflin, died yesterday of grief caused by a malicious libel published in The World of October 25th. Has not our family suffered enough? Please insert this notice for a heartbroken family. Victoria Claflin Martin, number 17 Hyde Park Gate, London. End quote. Seemed like maybe, just maybe, the Beecher sisters were still not done with the Claflin sisters. They certainly had the money, power, and influence to keep using the press to avenge their brother. Victoria tried her best to live a quiet life in her third marriage. She took part in the British women's suffrage movement, but she wasn't as loud about it as her other causes. Along with her daughter, Zula, she published a journal called Humanitarian. This went on from 1892 to 1901. The purpose of the journal? The promotion of eugenics. Yes, she never let that go. Victoria and her sister lived to see some women gain the right to vote in Great Britain and in the United States. In Great Britain, the Representation of the People Act of 1918 granted the vote to women over 30 who owned property. 2 years later, the U.S.'s 19th Amendment would grant that right to all women, at least on paper. Women who weren't white continued to face barriers to voting through poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, and even flat-out exclusion for indigenous Native Americans who weren't considered citizens. But hey, those are just poor white women in the UK and non-white women in the US.
Victoria wouldn't have cared about any of them anyway. She died in 1927 at the age of 88. The following year, in Victoria's adopted country of Great Britain, all women aged 21 and over were given the right to vote, regardless of property ownership. Are you a content creator who feels like you're doing all the right things, but your channel still isn't growing the way you want it to? Are you making content, but not making money? Or maybe you're a business owner who knows you need to be on YouTube, but you have no idea where to start? If that's you, I'd love to help. I have a membership called Hot Mess University where I teach creators how to actually build sustainable income on YouTube. Not just views, not just subscribers, but real revenue. The link is in the description box. And if you're serious, like serious, and you want to work with me one-on-one, send me an email. My email address is also in the description box. I work with content creators, and I'm also very interested in working with businesses who are ready to use YouTube strategically. Now let me tell you what's possible when you actually implement what I teach. Keisha Irvin is my YouTube colleague and friend. Her channel is Color Me Pink. When she first talked to me about her channel in 2022, she was making $2,500 a month on YouTube, and that's a really good side hustle income. We worked together at the end of January, and her very next check, February, was a little over $7,000. And here's the key. She implemented 90% of what I told her right away. She didn't sit on it. She did the work. And now, Keisha consistently earns between $9,000 to $12,000 on YouTube every single month. I actually interviewed her about her journey in my membership, and I uploaded that interview to my YouTube tips channel. I'll leave a link to that interview on the end screen so you can hear it straight from her and see her actual earnings. She opened up everything in that interview. So if you're still breathing, and I know you are because you're watching, it's not too late to do your thing. And if YouTube is your thing, consider checking out Hot Mess University or email me so that we can see if we're a good fit for one-on-one work. I look forward to working with you, and I'll see you on the next video. I want to give a heartfelt thank you to Dr. Stephanie Athey for her valuable insights that enriched this documentary. Her book, Torture in the National Security Imagination, is an incredible read. I purchased a copy recently and have been thoroughly enjoying it. You can learn more about Dr. Athey and her work at stephanieathey.com. Be sure to check it out. I have her link placed in the top of the description box here and in the pinned comment of this video. My sources for this story are the Brooklyn Daily Times Archives, 1871, New York Herald Archives, 1872, Brooklyn Eagle Archives, 1874, Chicago Tribune Archives, 1885, the San Francisco Examiner Archives, 1877 and 1885, Fort Worth Star Telegram Archives, 1927, Recalling Another Strange Historic Election by Colleen Walsh for the Harvard Gazette, and the Fresno Bee Archives, 1960.
64parishes.org, Caitlin V. Voicey, the Historic New Orleans Collection, New Orleans Public Library, MessyNessyChic.com, LosLatidosDelJazz.com, The Times Democrat Archives, 1898, 1909, and 1913.
The Gloucestershire Echo Archives, 1909. Titanic Children, Eyewitnesses to History, edited by Anthony Cunningham. The Brooklyn Daily Eagle Archives, 1912. Britannica.com. The Birmingham Post Archives, 1912. EncyclopediaTitanica.org. The Essex Newsman Herald Archives, 1912. ExploreThePast.co.uk. Sunday Dispatch Archives, 1912. soliloquism.com. Birmingham Evening Mail Archives, 1917. Washington Times Archives, 2012. And the Rock Island Argus Archives, 2016.
The Los Angeles Times Archives, 1899, 1900, and 2000, and the Huntington Library Art Collections.